cry in the stillness, and a secret buried in Larkspur Lane. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're joining from. I love hearing from you all. Now, let's begin. The afternoon sun lay soft upon Larkspur Lane, gilding the neat rows of cottage gardens where hollyhocks leaned in the breeze and roses nodded with sleepy grace. It was the sort of summer day when time itself seemed to idle, and the little village of St. Mildred's basked in the illusion that nothing of consequence could disturb its tranquil rhythm. The hum of bees, the faint clip of distant shears from the vicarage garden, and the smell of newly baked bread from Mrs. Ellison's window gave the lane an almost painterly perfection. At precisely 3 o'clock, this peaceful scene was interrupted by a sound quite out of keeping with the mood. A sharp, startled cry from somewhere near the old gatehouse at the far bend. It was quickly followed by hurried footsteps and the unmistakable clatter of something metallic striking stone. A young delivery boy, breathless and pale, came pelting down the lane, his cap askew. "They say there's been an accident," he blurted to Mrs. Partridge, who was clipping lavender at her gate. But the word accident was already giving way to more colorful suggestions before he had even reached the next house. By the time the boy disappeared around the corner toward the green, the first tremors of gossip had begun to ripple outward. It was not long before the entire lane seemed to lean in toward the mystery. Mrs. Ellison claimed she'd seen a man, tall, with a dark coat quite unsuitable for the weather, standing by the gatehouse earlier. Mrs. Partridge countered that it must have been Mr. Braithwaite from the manor, though why he would be lurking about was anyone's guess. And Mrs. Bloom, peering over her hedge, whispered to anyone who would listen that she'd heard the word murder spoken in hushed tones by Constable Reed himself. At the far end of the lane, behind a modest hedge that concealed a trim and well-ordered garden, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly with her knitting. From her wicker chair, she had an unobstructed view of the comings and goings along the road. Her needles moved with steady precision, though her blue eyes, alert beneath the brim of her straw hat, missed nothing. She had heard the cry, noted the direction of the boy's flight, and even observed, with the faintest quirk of her lips, the curious way Mrs. Ellison's account had altered in the space of 5 minutes. She did not rise, nor call out to inquire. Years of experience had taught her that the first flurry of village chatter was best left to ripen. In such moments, people often revealed more than they intended. And Miss Marple had long ago learned that the truth of a matter was rarely in the grand declarations, but in the small, almost invisible details. Somewhere beyond the bend of Larkspur Lane, something very odd had occurred. Whether it was truly an accident, as some claimed, or something far more deliberate, Miss Marple could not yet say. But as the murmur of speculation drifted toward her garden, she began, as she always did, to sort through the possibilities, quietly, methodically, and without the faintest outward sign that she was doing so at all. It would not be long before someone came to tell her the full tale. And when they did, she would be ready to listen. Miss Marple had only to wait a few minutes longer. As she expected, the garden gate clicked, and Mrs. Partridge's sensible straw hat appeared, followed by the rest of Mrs. Partridge in a flurry of lavender sprigs and earnest purpose. "Miss Marple, dear, I'm so sorry. Lady Braithwaite's in a state, and the constable's there, and Dr. Morton, too. It's Mr. Fisk, Lionel Fisk, from the manor office. They say he's fallen at the gatehouse. Would you— Oh, do say you will come. You're such a comfort in a crisis." Miss Marple rose with the mild air of one acceding to a simple invitation and set her knitting neatly upon the chair. If I can be of any use, Harriet, of course. A fall, you say? That is the sort of thing that so often happens at the very step one has climbed 100 times safely. Quite so, said Mrs. Partridge, already half turned to shepherd her along the path. But there was such a dreadful clatter, and young Alfie from the bakery nearly ran into the bicycle outside. Mrs. Ellison says, well, you know how she is. But she says she saw a man in a dark coat by the hedge not 20 minutes before, and why anyone would wear such a thing in this heat. Perhaps, said Miss Marple gently, because he had not meant to be seen. They went together, Mrs. Partridge bobbing little courtesies at neighbors who craned from garden gates. The lane's soft hum had sharpened into that special pitch of village concern, half sympathy, half appetite. As they passed Mrs. Ellison's window, Miss Marple gave the slightest tilt of her head. The baker's wife stood without her customary oven cloth, her hands flower-paled and oddly idle. She had, then, come out fast, contrary to her earlier assertion that she had spoken to the man by the hedge while still at her cooling tray. Small things, Miss Marple thought, were not so small. The gatehouse at the bend was a picturesque little square of stone, with a pitched roof and a narrow door worn smooth by generations of hands. A bicycle with a raincoat flung across its bars leaned against the garden wall. The coat was dark and heavy, made for a colder month, yet the day was not merely warm but distinctly summery. In the gravel close by, a set of prints showed a hasty arrival. Scuffed heels, a twist mark, as of one steadied suddenly. And the gate itself, an old iron affair, stood ajar with its padlock dangling, the key still in it. Constable Reed, broad and red-faced, tried to swell taller as Miss Marple. Approached, as if by the application of authority one might improve the facts. Now then, Miss Marple, good afternoon. No need for alarm. Dr. Morton's seen to it. A sad accident, that's how it looks. Mr. Fisk must have tripped coming in. Corner of the steps a nasty angle. I am sorry to hear it, said Miss Marple, who did indeed look sorry. Her eyes, however, slid past the constable's shoulder to the narrow hall within. A man lay just beyond the threshold where the flags gave way to a small flight of 3 steps. On the middle one, the edge was slightly rough, where old stone had chipped. Dr. Morton knelt, grave and brisk, his bag open and his stethoscope dangling uselessly now. Neck broken in the fall, he said quietly to Miss Marple, as one would to an old friend in a pew. A blow at the temple, too, but that looks incidental. The head caught the stair on the way down. Time of death not many minutes after 3, I'd say. The poor fellow's heart must have stopped very shortly after that shout we all heard. Miss Marple nodded. The metallic clatter, then, was accounted for? She looked down. On the flagstones, near the dead man's outflung hand, lay the padlock's hasp and key ring, as if flung from fingers by surprise. Yet the key still hung in the gate outside. People were very untidy about keys, Miss Marple knew, but men in positions of petty authority often were not. Lionel Fisk, land agent to Lady Braithwaite's estate, had a reputation for neatness that reached even those who did not admire him. He had been precise about his ledgers and ruthless about overdue rents, and he had recently been very busy indeed about a contentious plan to sell off the lower meadow for development. Lady Braithwaite herself, pale beneath her garden hat, stood in the gatehouse's little sitting room, pressing a handkerchief to lips unaccustomed to tremble. Miss Marple, thank heavens. It's all too dreadful. Lionel had the keys to the old strong-box. There's an alcove off the kitchen. And he said he would fetch certain papers so that Mr. Braithwaite could... Well, there are matters of business. I sent word for him. He bicycled down. I should never have... Oh, what must I do? Sit down. Miss Marple murmured, touching her arm with simple kindness. There is nothing to be done that is not already being done. We must keep our heads. In the kitchen, the little strongbox stood open upon a low shelf, its lid up like a surprised mouth. Within lay nothing but a single sprig of larkspur, blue as a dropped piece of sky. Someone had placed it there. Whether sentimental or mocking, Miss Marple could not yet tell. But she did not care for emblems in empty boxes. They generally meant that something more than a fall had occurred. "Do you often keep papers here, my lady?" she asked. "Only those of no great importance. The gatehouse used to be the keeper's, you know. There are odd niches and cupboards. Lionel said he preferred to bring the valuation plans down here today, in case Mr. Braithwaite wished to meet him after his nap and look them over at leisure. But now they are gone." "Gone?" Constable Reed swung in, catching the last word. "Well now, perhaps Mr. Fisk took them out and, dropped them. We'll look." "There are no papers here," said Dr. Morton, who had already looked, because doctors who serve villages long enough learn to do what is sensible while the police propose what is hopeful. "Nor in the hall, nor," he added with the air of one trying to be moderate, "in the bicycle's tool bag, which I confess I glanced at, out of curiosity. There's nothing but a spanner and a hand pump." Miss Marple's gaze had already taken in the bicycle. It was a fine light machine, kept well, but the raincoat draped over it did not belong with it. The sleeves, folded back across the handlebars, were damp at the cuffs, peculiarly so given the dry day. The coat, she saw, had a discreet tailor's label stitched into the neck. Braithwaite and Company, Savile Row. Men sometimes had their names sewn in. Families with a taste for order often had the household's garments so marked by their London tailor. "It is kind of you to let your staff borrow a coat, Lady Braithwaite," Miss Marple observed, absently. Lady Braithwaite followed her glance and started. "That? But that is my husband's older coat. He has a newer one for town. He would not. Why is it here?" Constable Reed cleared his throat sturdily. "Likely Mr. Fisk fetched it from the manor, my lady, to keep dust off himself, and the papers bicycling. Too much sun, and folks do queer things." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, and stroked the air with a word as if smoothing a wrinkle from cloth. She was looking at the cuffs again. A very faint blue smudge stained one, not from dye, but pollen or bruised petal. The sort of mark garden folk get from brushing past tall delphiniums. Larkspur grew in liberal ranks along Mrs. Bloom's hedge a little way up the lane. To gather such color, one must not merely brush a sleeve, but push in, hand first, or stoop to cut. Miss Marple glanced sidelong at the sprig in the strongbox. An emblem, then, and possibly a message. Young Alfie, the delivery boy, hovered in the doorway, twisting his cap. Miss Marple beckoned him with grandmotherly directness. "You saw the bicycle, Alfie?" "Yes, miss. Like to have run straight into it. I was that shocked. I heard a shout, then a clink, like metal. And then there was Mrs. Bloom calling out as if she'd seen a ghost, though she hadn't. Only she will carry on. And then I run for the constable." "Before the shout?" Miss Marple asked, as if inquiring after the buns. "Did you notice anyone go in or out? A man in a dark coat, perhaps?" Alfie's eyes slid toward Mrs. Ellison, who had stationed herself in the hall with an air of having every right to be there. "There was a coat, miss, like on the bars. I don't know as to the person. I was looking at the cakes in my basket. Only, well, someone was speaking in there," he blurted and reddened. "Not loud like. A lady, I think, low voice, but cross." "Cross," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if disappointed or as if thwarted. Alfie looked helpless. "Like when Mum finds I've done the eggs but left the sink. That sort, thank you," said Miss Marple, and let him go. Constable Reed frowned. "We'll take statements in due course. Can't have every lad in the village fancied as a witness." Dr. Morton had finished his examination and rose, wiping his hands. "I'll fetch the ambulance. Reed, you'll want to—" "Yes," said the constable with a look at Miss Marple that meant to be firm and came out almost pleading. "This is police work now, Miss Marple. We mustn't, clutter the place with ladies." He realized as he said it that Lady Braithwaite was a lady too, and coughed. "Of course," said Miss Marple, smiling. "Perhaps I might only set the kettle? People bear bad news better with tea, I've always found. Lady Braithwaite, you should drink something." She moved, small and unremarkable, into the little kitchen and busied herself with cups and a kettle that knew the routine. On the table stood a single teacup already used, the faint half-moon of lipstick on the rim, a color too lively for Lady Braithwaite's taste. Miss Marple touched it with a finger and thought of the coral shade Mrs. Ellison had admired in the draper's window but never dared purchase, and of Mrs. Durrant at the manor, whose mouth was always that decided pink, and who had once said she would sooner be dead than be turned out of her cottage when the meadow went. She carried the tea back in its tray and set it down calmly. Outside, the murmur had thickened. New tidings had arrived and were being packed into shape for retelling. Mr. Braithwaite, tall, dark, and very conscious of himself, came up the path with the gait of a man who dislikes being summoned. He glanced at the bicycle, at the coat, and then at Miss Marple with a flicker of annoyance not quite concealed. "My coat," he said shortly to Reed. "Why is that here?" "We wondered the same, sir," said the constable, trying to sound as if he had wondered it first. "Mr. Fisk? Well, perhaps he brought it. Whether—" "Nonsense," said Mr. Braithwaite. "He had no cause. Where are the papers?" "The strong box is empty," Lady Braithwaite said faintly. "Dear, Lionel is— There has been an accident." Mr. Braithwaite's face worked. He made an effort toward sympathy and produced a rather jagged version of it. "Terrible. Terrible. But we must be practical. The plans, Reed, make certain no one has touched them." "No one has," said Miss Marple, and her voice was so mild that it failed to register as contradiction. "Except for the person who took them away and left a flower to say so." Mr. Braithwaite stared at her. "Flower?" "Larkspur," said Dr. Morton, who had the habit of making gloomy jokes when anxious. "It is Larkspur Lane, after all." "It is not amusing," Mr. Braithwaite snapped. "No," said Miss Marple. She was thinking of the damp coat cuffs, and of Mrs. Ellison's hands idling without their cloth, and of Alfie's cross voice, and of the way people, when staging accidents, always overdid something, left a symbol too pointed or arranged a lock too prominently. She moved to the hall again and looked, not at the body, but at the doorframe. There was a faint scrape on the wood at shoulder height, as if a heavier man than Mr. Fisk had brushed against it, carrying something awkward. Perhaps the strong box itself, though that had not been moved. Reed followed her look. "We'll dust for— well—" He floundered and settled on hopefulness again. "There'll be marks." "Marks are like opinions," Miss Marple said. "There are always rather too many of them. But people's habits, Constable, those are the things one can count upon. Mr. Fisk, I have always understood, disliked raincoats. He preferred a golfing cape in bad weather. He would not, I think, lay claim to another man's coat on a sunny day. And if he had done so, he would not have put it on so carelessly that the sleeves dragged in the borders and picked up blue. That speaks of haste and of someone less used to careful gardening paths. Mr. Braithwaite made a small, contemptuous sound. Garden lore and gossip. Miss Marple smiled at him as if he had paid her a compliment. One learns a good deal from both. There was another stir at the gate. Mrs. Durrant, the manor housekeeper, had arrived, flanked by Mrs. Bloom, who looked like a satisfied hen. Mrs. Durrant's mouth was indeed the decided pink Miss Marple remembered, but her face today was drained of the color that usually supported it. She had the rigid dignity of one determined not to be seen, to tremble. "I came at once," she said. "My lady, forgive me. They said Mr. Fisk." "Oh." Her eyes fell on the bicycle, the coat, and then swiftly away. Almost too swiftly, Miss Marple thought, the way a person looks at a thing she recognizes and must not reveal she recognizes. "I can be of use. Shall I make tea?" "That is very kind," Miss Marple said, the picture of gratitude. "We have begun already? Perhaps you could tell me, Mrs. Durrant. Do you know if Mr. Fisk had enemies?" Mrs. Durrant gave the weary, decent answer one gives to such improper questions. "Why, no one is an enemy in a village, Miss Marple. We are neighbors." "Neighbors?" Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, though sometimes neighbors want the same patch of earth. The lower meadow, for instance." Mrs. Durrant's eyes flashed. "That meadow is the manor's." "Of course," Miss Marple said, and Mr. Fisk, being diligent, wished to see it sold advantageously. She did not press. She only watched the tiny stiffening of Mrs. Durrant's shoulders and stored it away beside the lipstick cup and the larkspur sprig. Dr. Morton's men came with the stretcher. There is a hush that falls when a body is lifted. Even the great talkers grow gentle for a moment. As Mr. Fisk was carried out, Miss Marple stood slightly aside and looked down, just once, at the face. It was not a wicked face. It was a small, tight face, officious perhaps, with a narrow band of sweat across the brow that had dried to salt. A man who had governed his corner of the world and been resented for it. A man who would have turned a meadow into money and thought himself virtuous for it. A man who, if he had enemies, would be unable to imagine why. When they were gone, the gatehouse felt emptier, which was natural, and staged, which was not. Reed hovered near the strong-box, then shut it decisively as if closing a chapter. "Well, Miss Marple," he said with an attempt at jollity, "we'll call it an accident until we're told otherwise." Miss Marple tilted her head. "There is a virtue, Constable, in allowing things to be what they are. I wonder only if this will be permitted to remain an accident. They so seldom are when everybody tries so hard to say they must be." Lady Braithwaite, who had not let go of her handkerchief, looked up. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at all, my lady," said Miss Marple with the sweetness that had soothed many nervous women and disarmed more than one pompous man. "Only that Mr. Fisk seems to have been in company shortly before he fell. A lady who was cross in a restrained way. A cup that was not yours. A coat that is your husband's, though perhaps that is domestic confusion. And a flower put where flowers do not usually go. All very slight things. But I have observed that when slight things gather themselves together, they generally point." "To whom?" Mr. Braithwaite demanded. "Oh," said Miss Marple, "that is precisely what I do not know yet. But when people are afraid, they often do something they imagine looks ordinary, and it does not look ordinary at all. For instance," she added, as if struck by a sudden housewifely thought, "when a raincoat has been sponged at the cuffs and put out to dry, very sensibly, one expects to find it hanging by the scullery door, not draped on a bicycle. And when a man comes to fetch papers, he means to keep safe. He ordinarily brings a case for them, not a flower for the box they were in. She had expected someone to bristle, and Mr. Braithwaite obliged. This is absurd. Reed, I insist you recover those plans at once. Search the lane. Search the hedges. Certainly, sir, said Reed, too grateful for a straightforward order. He went out with an air of consequence, calling to a constable who had been stationed to hold back the curious. Mrs. Partridge hovered at Miss Marple's elbow. Do you think someone pushed him? I think, said Miss Marple, that someone made sure no one would ask too closely. People think a fall is simpler than a quarrel. They forget how badly people quarrel when money visits them. She patted Mrs. Partridge's hand. We shall not hurry. Hurrying is how people miss the things that are right under their nose. As if to oblige her, something right under everyone's noses made itself known. Miss Marple had noticed at once that the bicycle's bell had a tiny dent and that the front brake cable had been tightened more than most cyclists liked. Now, as she ran a finger over the handle to set the bell straight, the little brass cap at the end of the handlebar came away, revealing a roll of thin paper plugged into the hollow. She did not exclaim. She did not, in fact, do anything save slip the brass back on and smooth the leather with the absent air of one who has tidied a thing that irked her. Then she turned and looked across the room at Mrs. Durrant and at Mrs. Ellison, who were dutifully fussing over cups and saucers and not looking at the bicycle at all. Harriet, dear, she said serenely to Mrs. Partridge, shall we walk back together? I have left my knitting out. One can't be too careful of the sun on wool. Constable, you will let me know if Lady Braithwaite should require any, what is the modern word, support? Certainly, Miss Marple, Reed said. And then, as if compelled by her calm into civility, and thank you. They stepped out into the soft day again. The lane had resumed, at least outwardly, its unmoved countenance, but the eyes behind curtains were bright. Miss Marple walked at a pace gentle enough for Mrs. Partridge and her thoughts both. She was thinking of the raincoat, of the blue smudge, of the lipstick, of a lady who had been cross without quite daring to be angry. She was thinking, too, of the little paper tucked into the handlebar, and of the way men who are exact hate to leave things unsecured. Mr. Fiske had not, she judged, been riding his bicycle far with something so interesting, hidden in a place so fragile. But someone had. Such a tragedy, Mrs. Partridge murmured. And he was not a bad man, though he did go on about rates and drains. Do you suppose the papers matter, truly? Plans and such? Plans, said Miss Marple, matter to some people. But it is not plans that usually make people dangerous. It is the fear of losing what they think is theirs. At her gate, Miss Marple paused and looked back down the curve of Larkspur Lane to where the gatehouse roof just peeped above the hedge. The summer light made everything look innocent. That, she reflected, was the difficulty with summer. It told comforting lies. She went in, fetched her knitting, and sat again in her wicker chair as if she had never left it. In the privacy of her lap, she removed, very quietly, the brass cap she had taken when no one was watching and eased out the paper roll. It was narrow, tightly wound, and when teased open revealed a penciled sketch of the lower meadow divided into neat rectangles, each marked with an initial. Not a valuation plan. That would be formal and bold. This was something different. A promise list. She traced the letters with a forefinger. C, D, E. The D was a firm, decisive Roman hand she recognized from the Manor's Christmas lists. D for Durrant. There were other letters, too, and the brazen practicality of them told her more than any speech would have done. Miss Marple smiled, not happily. She had been right. It was not only a fall. And someone had been, in their way, very tidy indeed. If one didn't mind that their tidiness had cost a man his life. Miss Marple did not, of course, leave the sketch lying about. She smoothed it flat between the pages of a gardening almanac, the sort of book no visitor would think to open, and returned to her knitting with the air of one absorbed in a dropped stitch. But her mind was far from the larkspur bed or the neat little trellises along her garden wall. She was considering the initials. The D for Durrant was plain enough. C could be any number of people. Clark from the post office, perhaps, or Cyril Troughton, the retired solicitor who spent his days playing chess on the green. E was almost certainly Ellison, though she had never thought Mrs. Ellison particularly concerned with property beyond her rose garden. Yet people surprised one, and greed was not a vice exclusive to men in city offices. Still, if the list were genuine, and the hurried hand and smudges suggested it had been drawn in haste rather than fabricated for show, it meant that Mr. Fisk had been making private arrangements, promises of parcels in the lower meadow, likely at advantageous prices for friends or those with influence, that could breed resentment. And if someone else had found the list, they might well see to it that Fisk never had the chance to revise it, or to tell Lady Braithwaite what he had been about. Mrs. Partridge had taken herself off with a final pat to Miss Marple's arm, leaving her in peace. It was peace only to the casual eye. Miss Marple's ears were tuned to the faint rise and fall of voices drifting up the lane from the gatehouse. The police would be going over the place again, and the village would be supplying them with as many contradictory statements as could be squeezed into the hour. She wondered which would come to her first, the official version from Constable Reed or the embroidered one from Mrs. Bloom. It proved to be neither. Instead, it was Mrs. Durrant herself who came briskly through the gate, her mouth set in a line too tight for comfort. "Miss Marple," she said, dispensing with pleasantries, "I must speak with you." "May I?" "Of course, Mrs. Durrant. Do sit down. It is warm for walking." Mrs. Durrant declined the chair and stood, hands clasped before her. "There is talk," she said, without preamble. "Talk that I was seen at the gatehouse earlier today. It is not true. I was at the manor until 3:30, and Mrs. Ellison herself brought up the tea tray at 25 past. "That was thoughtful of her," Miss Marple observed mildly. A busy day for Mrs. Ellison, then, delivering trays and running messages, and yet with time to speak to strangers by the hedge. Mrs. Durrant's mouth tightened further. "If she says she saw me there, she is lying. I had no reason to visit Mr. Fisk, and less to quarrel with him. Yes, I object to the meadow being sold, but that is my right. My cottage is near enough to be affected, and I do not care to have strangers building on my doorstep." Miss Marple nodded as if the point were unassailable. Perfectly reasonable. "And I certainly did not," Mrs. Durrant hesitated, glancing toward the lane. "I know what they're thinking, that I pushed him, or worse. But I couldn't. I wouldn't." "Couldn't, Mrs. Durrant?" Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as a cat settling on a cushion. The housekeeper flushed. I was in my work dress. Do you think I could manhandle a man of his size? And what about the coat? They say it's Mr. Braithwaite's. I've never touched the thing." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as though weighing the truth of that. "Coats do find their way about a house," she said. "One might put one over an arm without thinking. But tell me, did you notice, at any time this week, someone lingering near the gatehouse?" Mrs. Durrant hesitated again, then gave a short nod. "Yesterday morning, when I went to gather herbs for the kitchen, I saw Cyril Troughton down there, He said he was admiring the stonework, but it's not like him to be out so early. He is not a man for morning air. A curious choice of stroll, yes, Miss Marple agreed. Thank you, Mrs. Durrant. And you are quite right. People do leap to conclusions. Best not to give them fuel. When Mrs. Durrant had gone, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. People rarely came to protest their innocence without fearing the opposite was already believed. It was useful in its way. Guilt made some silent, and fear made others talk too much. Both could be revealing. By late afternoon, Constable Reed arrived, his expression a mix of officiousness and faint unease. Miss Marple, I thought it best to keep you informed. Off the record, mind. Doctor says Fisk's death was consistent with a fall, though the blow to the temple could have been from something other than the step. Can't prove it wasn't the step, of course. And the papers, well, they haven't turned up. No doubt they will, Miss Marple said, pouring tea. People do have a way of putting things in safe places and forgetting them, or putting them in unsafe places and hoping no one will look. Reed took the cup but didn't drink. Between ourselves, there's something queer about the timing. Braithwaite says he sent for Fisk at 2:45. Alfie reckons he heard the shout at about 3 o'clock sharp. That gives barely 15 minutes for Fisk to leave the manor, cycle down, fetch the papers, and, well, fall. And Alfie swears he heard voices before the shout. Voices take less time than cycling, Miss Marple remarked, and sometimes achieve more. Reed gave her a look both wary and hopeful. If you've noticed anything— Oh, I've noticed quite a lot, Constable. I dare say you have too. Only some things take their meaning from the company they keep. A flower in a box is one thing. A flower in a box with missing papers and a man in another's coat is quite another. Reed frowned. That coat. Braithwaite's sure it's his. Says it's been at the back of his wardrobe since last winter. Then it must have come out for a purpose, Miss Marple said. Coats do not walk by themselves. After Reed had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while, watching the long shadows stretch across her garden. She was thinking about the list, about who would benefit from the meadow being divided quietly among a select few, and who might object violently to being left off. She was thinking, too, of Mrs. Ellison's idle hands and Mrs. Durrant's over-ready denial, and of Cyril Troughton in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the evening drew in, she took a slow walk toward the green, where she knew she would encounter the informal court of village opinion, the benches by the war memorial. Sure enough, Mrs. Bloom was holding forth to an attentive audience, her voice pitched just low enough to suggest discretion while ensuring every word carried. And I told her, I said, "It's not natural, you in a coat on a day like this." And she just laughed, all high and nervous-like. And then not half an hour later, well, you've heard the rest. "Mrs. Bloom," Miss Marple said pleasantly as she drew near, "how fortunate to find you. I was just wondering, this person you spoke to wearing the coat, was it before or after Alfie came running?" Mrs. Bloom blinked, perhaps caught off guard by the directness. "Before, Miss Marple. Oh, a good 20 minutes before. I was trimming the hedge and she came up from the gatehouse path. I didn't see her face proper, what with the sun in my eyes. But the coat was dark and the sleeves too long for her. She had to push them back." "And did you notice any mark on the sleeve?" Mrs. Bloom hesitated, then nodded. "A sort of blue smear, like from the flowers. I thought maybe she'd been helping herself to my larkspur. Cheeky thing." Miss Marple thanked her and walked on. her thoughts knitting themselves into a pattern. The coat with the blue smudge had been seen 20 minutes before the fall, worn by a woman who pushed back the sleeves. That narrowed the possibilities. Mrs. Ellison's hands had been floury earlier, but there had been no flour on the cuffs. Mrs. Durrant claimed never to have touched the coat, and Mrs. Bloom had not recognized the face. Yet sleeves pushed back could conceal the hands very neatly indeed. When she returned home, the dusk settling over Larkspur Lane, Miss Marple found a note slipped under her door. The hand was round and unpracticed, the sort used by people who do not write often. It contained only 2 lines. He was going to ruin us all. Ask about the meadow last spring. No signature, but the faint scent of rosewater clung to the paper. Miss Marple closed her door softly and sat down to think. The meadow last spring? Yes. There had been something about a fair, a charity event held there, and some dispute over the takings. Small at the time, perhaps. But small grievances could grow in fertile soil. Somewhere among the hedges and the neat gardens of Larkspur Lane, someone had decided Lionel Fisk's plans, whether for the meadow or for themselves, could not be allowed to stand. And they had wrapped that decision in the folds of a borrowed coat, leaving behind only a flower and a fall. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again. The pattern was beginning to show through, though she would not pull the threads tight just yet. The village, she knew, would provide the rest in its own good time. The next morning brought a thin veil of mist over St. Mildred's, softening the outlines of the cottages and making Larkspur Lane seem even more self-contained, as though it had drawn its breath and was waiting. Miss Marple, who had risen early, found the quiet useful. The village was never entirely silent, but when people's minds were preoccupied, their footsteps slowed and their voices dropped, and that was the best time to observe without being observed. She stepped into her garden with her secateurs in hand, ostensibly to snip away a few browning rose heads, but in reality to see who was out and about. Mrs. Ellison was already at her front step, polishing the brass letterbox with unnecessary energy, her movements brisk and a little too determined. Mrs. Bloom passed on the other side of the lane, basket in hand, her glance sharp as a wren's, scanning the hedgerows as if they might still yield the missing papers. At 8:15, the sound of wheels on gravel announced a visitor to the Braithwaite Manor. Miss Marple looked up to see Cyril Troughton's old motor cars turning in at the gates, its fenders rattling faintly. That was unusual. Troughton rarely drove, preferring to be fetched in the Manor's trap when invited. The timing, too, was worth noting. Mr. Braithwaite was known to take breakfast late, and an early appointment suggested urgency. She decided a walk in that direction might be just the thing. By the time she reached the bend where the lane broadened toward the Manor Drive, Troughton's car was parked neatly to one side, and voices could be heard within the drawing room through the open windows. She caught only a few words: valuation, undisclosed, premature. But the tone was enough. Troughton's voice was smooth and cautious, while Braithwaite's carried a brittle edge. Miss Marple turned toward the kitchen entrance, where Mrs. Durrant was emerging with a tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Durrant. I see you have early visitors." "Yes?" Mrs. Durrant said shortly, as if not pleased to admit it. "Mr. Troughton. Something about the meadow, I gather." "Such an important piece of land," Miss Marple said, her tone no more than neighborly chat. "I imagine many have their hopes pinned to it." Mrs. Durrant's lips tightened, some more than they deserve. And then, almost as an afterthought, "Have you heard anything more about those papers?" "Nothing definite," Miss Marple replied, "but I dare say they will surface. Things have a way of doing so when people believe them safely hidden. Mrs. Durrant gave a short, mirthless laugh. Hidden? In this village? Nothing stays hidden long. It was a remark with more truth than she perhaps intended. Miss Marple, filing it away, continued her stroll and soon found herself at the gatehouse again. The police had sealed it for the moment, though Constable Reed was stationed there, looking uncomfortable as only a man who knows everyone and must suspect someone can look. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Just keeping watch," he said. "I am sure you are," she answered kindly. "Tell me, Constable, have you determined who wore the coat before Mr. Fisk's fall?" Reed rubbed his chin. "We're not certain. Mrs. Bloom says it was a lady, but she can't or won't name her. And Mr. Braithwaite insists he never lent it to anyone. I'll get to the bottom of it." "I'm sure you will," Miss Marple said again, but without any trace of mockery. She knew Reed was thorough, though thoroughness without understanding was like sweeping only where the light fell. As she turned back toward the village, she encountered Alfie, the delivery boy, pedaling slowly with his empty basket. He hesitated when he saw her, then stopped altogether. "Miss Marple, could I tell you something? Only it's not really about the fall, like." "You may tell me whatever you wish, Alfie," she said, and meant it. "It's just, yesterday, before all that happened, I was cutting through by the allotments, and I saw Mrs. Ellison talking to Mr. Troughton, and she had a big brown envelope in her hand. She gave it to him, and he put it in his coat. Only I don't think it was the same coat he had on later. It was lighter. And when she saw me, she went all flustered and said she'd been giving him a recipe. But I've never seen a recipe in an envelope like that." Miss Marple thanked him gravely. Alfie was an observant boy, and his account dovetailed neatly with the growing pattern. An envelope could well contain plans, or it could be something else entirely, but the secrecy with which it had been handed over was telling. And if Troughton had later been at the manor, speaking about valuations, then the chain of events was tightening. Back in her garden, Miss Marple took out the folded sketch she had hidden and studied it once more. The initials had the air of an informal arrangement, something not yet official, but meant to be kept within a small circle. If Fisk had intended to keep it secret until his position was stronger, then any premature disclosure could have been disastrous for him and advantageous for someone else. By mid-morning, the mist had burned off, and the village was in full speculation. At the grocer's, Miss Marple heard Mrs. Bloom expound on the theory that the Larkspur sprig had been a warning, perhaps linked to an old quarrel between the Braithwaites and a rival family. At the same time, Mr. Larkin, the postmaster, confided that he'd seen Mr. Braithwaite himself walking down toward the gatehouse an hour before the accident, though whether he'd actually gone in was uncertain. After leaving the grocer's, Miss Marple paused by Mrs. Ellison's gate. "Such a warm morning for polishing brass," she remarked. Mrs. Ellison flushed, but her voice was light. "One must keep up appearances, Miss Marple. I hear they've found nothing new." "One hears many things," Miss Marple agreed. "For example, I heard you were kind enough to take a tea tray to Mrs. Durrant yesterday at the manor. That was about 3:25, I believe?" "Yes," Mrs. Ellison said, a touch too quickly. "I often do." Mrs. Durrant was busy in the kitchen. "And before that, you had time for a walk near the hedge by the gatehouse?" Mrs. Ellison's hands stilled on the rag she held. "Who told you that?" "Merely village talk," Miss Marple said, letting the pause do its work. "It is curious how coats wander about, isn't it? One sees them on one person in the morning and another in the afternoon." Mrs. Ellison's eyes flickered. "Well, I don't know anything about that. And now, "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple." She retreated into her house, leaving Miss Marple with the distinct impression that she had not been wrong to connect Mrs. Ellison to the coat and the hedge. But the exact sequence of events still needed to be clear in her mind before she could draw a conclusion. That afternoon, Reed came again, looking more harried. "We've found the missing plans. Burned. Just scraps in the ash bin behind the gatehouse. Couldn't make much out, but enough to tell they were the valuation papers for the meadow." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Burned in haste, I suppose? Looks that way. And here's the thing. Dr. Morton says the fall might not have killed Fisk outright. Could have been stunned, then finished off. But with what? We've found nothing like a weapon." Miss Marple thought of the strongbox, of the empty hall, and of the metallic clatter Alfie had heard. Perhaps the weapon was something that would not look like one. A padlock, for instance, swung hard enough, could be most effective, and would not be missed if it were put straight back where it belonged. Reed blinked. "You think—" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that we must consider who had the opportunity to be in that hallway with Mr. Fisk at the right moment, and who had reason to make certain the papers would never be used. Someone, perhaps, who had already passed the plans to another and feared discovery." As Reed left to consider this, Miss Marple sat back, her mind turning over the morning's observations. The web was drawing tighter. Cyril Troughton with his envelope. Mrs. Ellison near the hedge, possibly in the borrowed coat. Mrs. Durrant protesting too soon. Mr. Braithwaite with his brittle urgency. And somewhere in all that, the sprig of larkspur. Too deliberate to be whimsy, too pointed to be accident. She smiled faintly. The village had given her nearly all the pieces. What remained was to see who would make the next mistake. And they would. People always did, when they thought the talk was dying down and the eyes had turned away. In St. Mildred's, the eyes never truly did. By the following morning, the tension in St. Mildred's had settled into that peculiar kind of village calm where the surface looks placid, but underneath everyone is straining to hear the next whisper. Word had spread of the burned papers. Nobody knew how exactly, but Miss Marple had no doubt it had traveled through the unerring network of women exchanging eggs, milk, and confidences. The destruction of the meadow's valuation plans had set tongues wagging almost as much as the death of Lionel Fisk itself. Miss Marple spent the early part of the morning at her writing desk, composing a short note to her niece in London. A note which, though harmless in appearance, contained a few coded references to a matter she had been following in the local paper about property disputes. She always found it useful to fix her thoughts in writing, even if the intended reader would not grasp their full significance. By the time she sealed the envelope, she had arranged her suspicions into 2 tidy rows. Those who would gain by the sale of the meadow, and those who would lose by it. Shortly after 11, the clop of hooves on the lane announced the arrival of the Braithwaite trap. Mr. Braithwaite himself stepped down with his usual stiff precision. But the purpose of his visit to the lane was less formal than usual. He made directly for Mrs. Ellison's house. That in itself was remarkable. The Braithwaites maintained a polite distance from tradespeople, yet here he was, knocking at her door. Miss Marple, behind her lace curtains, saw Mrs. Ellison open it with evident surprise, followed by the 2 of them disappearing inside. She waited a discreet 10 minutes before taking her hat and stepping out under the pretext of delivering her letter to the postbox. By the time she passed Mrs. Ellison's gate, Mr. Braithwaite was leaving, his mouth set in a thin line and his hand gripping his walking stick as if he would rather have used it. He did not see her, or chose not to. Mrs. Ellison, in the doorway, looked flushed and unsettled. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison," Miss Marple said cheerily. "Such an unexpected pleasure to see Mr. Braithwaite here." Mrs. Ellison forced a smile. "Yes, well, he wanted to speak to me about parish matters, fundraising for the autumn fair." "Ah," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I had thought the Braithwaites preferred to leave such matters to the vicar. Still, one never knows. I hope it was a fruitful conversation." Mrs. Ellison gave a short, vague laugh and retreated into her house without answering. That was enough for Miss Marple. She had seen that look before, a mixture of guilt and resentment in equal measure. Someone who had been pressured, perhaps threatened, and was now trying to decide what to do about it. Her next stop was the post office, where Mr. Larkin confirmed, in the roundabout way of men who like to appear uninterested, that Cyril Troughton had sent a registered packet to an address in Bristol late the previous afternoon. Could have been anything, of course, he said, but it was about the size of a sheaf of papers. Paid extra for the insurance, too. That neatly tied Troughton to the missing valuation plans, or to some copy of them. If Mrs. Ellison had passed him an envelope before Fisk's death, and the next day he was sending something off to Bristol, the sequence was almost too convenient. Unless, of course, it was meant to look that way. By early afternoon, Miss Marple had settled herself in her garden with a book, knowing perfectly well that the warmth of the day would draw others out. True to form, Mrs. Bloom soon appeared at her gate, her errand to the green having clearly been manufactured solely to pass by and impart some fresh morsel. "They're saying now," Mrs. Bloom began without preamble, "that poor Mr. Fisk had been in some kind of dispute with the land surveyor. Over fees it was, and that the surveyor was seen in the lane last week talking to Mrs. Durrant. She says it was about her kitchen roof, but that's just what she would say." Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise. Disputes over money can be very bitter, especially when both sides believe themselves in the right. Mrs. Bloom leaned in a little. "And I've heard, though don't say I told you, that Mrs. Ellison's been putting money aside for a move to her sister's in Torquay. Why would she, if she's so fond of her little house here? Unless she thinks things are about to change." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, tucking that away. If the sale of the meadow meant new developments, it could change the character of the lane entirely, and drive out those who preferred the village as it was. Later, the shadows lengthened. Constable Reed came by, more openly troubled than before. "Miss Marple, I'm in a bit of a puzzle. We've established that Fisk arrived at the gatehouse about 5 minutes to 3. Mrs. Ellison says she saw him ride past her house then. Alfie's timing puts the shout at 3 sharp. That's barely enough time for him to get off his bicycle, unlock the gate, fetch the papers, and... well, unless," Miss Marple said, "he was met at the gate by someone already inside. Someone who could persuade him to step in quickly or confront him before he had time to collect anything." Reed nodded. "And that someone, if Mrs. Bloom's sighting is accurate, was a woman wearing Braithwaite's coat. But we've not been able to place anyone definitely in it." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, then said, "Tell me, Constable, has anyone mentioned seeing Mrs. Durrant at all between 2:30 and 3:30? Reed frowned. "Not that I recall. She says she was in the manor kitchen all that time, but nobody's confirmed it. The kitchen girl was sent on an errand to the dairy." "That's interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "So she could have slipped out unseen, if she wished. And if she wished to disguise herself, a long coat would be an excellent choice, especially if the sleeves were long enough to hide her hands." Reed looked doubtful. But why would she? She's not the sort to... Constable, Miss Marple said gently. The sort to commit murder is not a sort one recognizes beforehand, only afterward. That evening, as she sat by her window knitting, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Durrant walking briskly toward the gatehouse, glancing over her shoulder twice. She carried something wrapped in brown paper. 10 minutes later, she emerged without it. When the lane was quiet again, Miss Marple slipped out, her step light despite her age, and followed the curve to the gatehouse. Behind the hedge near the ash bin where the burned papers had been found was the brown paper parcel, hastily shoved into the shrubbery. She brought it home unopened, laying it on her kitchen table. Only when she was sure no one had seen her return did she carefully peel away the paper. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its first pages filled in Mr. Fisk's neat hand. The later pages, however, bore other handwriting, firmer, more angular, listing not only the meadow parcels, but amounts of money beside each name. It was a record not of valuation, but of payoffs. Miss Marple closed the book thoughtfully. So this was what had been worth killing for. Not merely the sale of land, but the quiet division of profits among a select few. And in such schemes, secrecy was everything. Fisk's death had silenced the one man who knew every detail. Or so the murderer must have hoped. But Miss Marple knew now that she held the one thing that could unravel the whole affair. She also knew better than to reveal it too soon. In a village like St. Mildred's, truth was like a rare plant. It had to be coaxed into the open carefully, or it would wither under the first glare. She set the ledger aside, poured herself a small cup of tea, and smiled faintly into the steam. The trap was nearly ready. All that remained was to see which of the guilty would be unable to resist stepping into it first. The following day broke bright and clear, the kind of morning that made St. Mildred's look like the front of a biscuit tin. Flowers in full bloom, windows open to let in the fresh air, and every path swept clean. But Miss Marple knew that appearances were the village's favorite disguise. Beneath the shine of its windows and the neatness of its hedges, there was a watchfulness, a prickling awareness that the death of Lionel Fisk had not been put to rest. She rose earlier than usual and placed the ledger, now wrapped again in its brown paper, in the bottom drawer of her writing desk. She had no intention of handing it to Constable Reed yet. Reed was a good man, but he had a tendency to treat physical evidence as the beginning and end of the matter, when in truth it was only the invitation to the dance. The important thing was to watch how people moved when they thought no one was leading them. By mid-morning, she had her excuse ready. She would walk up to the manor to deliver a jar of her blackcurrant jam to Lady Braithwaite, a little gift in these trying times. It was perfectly in character for her, and perfectly likely to gain her entrance. Lady Braithwaite received her in the morning room, still looking pale and unsettled. She was grateful for the jam, but quick to move on to the subject clearly preying on her mind. Miss Marple, this business with the meadow has taken on such a dreadful aspect. My husband insists it must be sold. But every time I venture out, someone tells me it will ruin the lane. I feel quite caught in the middle. Miss Marple sat primly, her gloved hands folded. It is a very great responsibility, my lady. The effect on the village will be lasting. I should think that would weigh on anyone. Lady Braithwaite sighed. I can't help thinking that poor Mr. Fisk's death has made things worse. My husband says we must press ahead, strike while the matter is unsettled, I think he said. But it all feels unseemly. That remark alone told Miss Marple a great deal. Pressing ahead while unsettled meant avoiding scrutiny. It meant tying up loose ends before others could tug them free. She let the conversation drift to other matters, then excused herself. Instead of returning directly home, she walked the long way around to pass Cyril Troughton's cottage. She found him in the front garden, pruning roses with more precision than warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Troughton. I hear you've been quite busy these past few days." He gave a short, guarded laugh. "Only with the usual dull business, Miss Marple. Though I imagine dull business is preferable to what you've been observing lately." "Indeed," she said mildly. "Dullness can be underrated. I dare say sending registered post livens things up, though." His pruning shears paused mid-snip. "Oh, that? Merely some personal correspondence." Miss Marple looked at him over the rim of her spectacles. "Of course. One never knows when one may need to secure a receipt." For a moment, he met her eyes. And in that moment, she was certain he understood she knew exactly what he had sent to Bristol. But Troughton was not the sort to volunteer anything unless cornered, and she was not ready to corner him yet. The afternoon brought a small but telling scene. Miss Marple was passing the green when she saw Mrs. Ellison and Mrs. Durrant in close conversation. The moment they spotted her, they broke apart, Mrs. Ellison retreating to the baker's with an unconvincing air of purpose, Mrs. Durrant marching toward the manor. Their expressions, flushed, tight-lipped, were those of people who had been discussing something they would rather not defend in public. She did not follow either of them, but instead went to sit on the bench beneath the lime tree, where she could watch the comings and goings of the lane. Within the hour, Constable Reed appeared, his expression suggesting he had come from a difficult conversation. "I've been to the manor again," he told her. "Mr. Braithwaite insists that nothing was taken from the gatehouse apart from the burned papers. But Mrs. Durrant says there was a small metal cash box that's now missing." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "Did she say what it contained?" "Petty cash for estate expenses, she claims. Only a few pounds, she says. But it's gone. Could be nothing." "Or could be a great deal," Miss Marple said softly. "Sometimes the value of a thing lies in what people believe is inside it." That evening, just after tea, she set her plan in motion. She wrote 3 notes, each brief and unsigned, and folded them in half. One she slipped under Mrs. Ellison's door, one under Mrs. Durrant's, and one she left in the letterbox at Mr. Troughton's. Each note contained only the words, "The ledger is safe. We must talk before it is too late." She wanted to see who would come, and more importantly, who would try not to be seen coming. The first to arrive, just as the church clock struck 8, was Mrs. Durrant. She was brisk, unsmiling, and carried the air of someone determined to be offended. "What is this about, Miss Marple?" she demanded, stepping into the parlor without waiting to be asked. Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. You received my note?" Mrs. Durrant gave a short nod. "I don't know what you think you have, but if it's what Fisk kept in his strong box, you'd best hand it to the police." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "But the strong box was empty, remember?" "I refer to something quite different. Something that lists certain names and certain amounts." For the first time, Mrs. Durrant's composure wavered. "If you mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple said mildly. "But if one's name were on such a list, and if the man keeping it were suddenly to die, it would be in one's interest to see the list destroyed." Mrs. Durrant's eyes flickered. "And if one's name were not on the list, it might be in one's interest to kill the man to stop the sale entirely." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "That is why such matters are never simple." They were interrupted by the sound of the gate clicking. Miss Marple glanced toward the window and saw Mrs. Ellison, glancing nervously over her shoulder, hurrying up the path. Mrs. Durrant stiffened. "This will be interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Ellison came in with none of Mrs. Durrant's force. She perched on the edge of the settee like a guilty schoolgirl. "I got your note," she said in a low voice. "I don't know what you mean by it, but if you've got anything of Fisk's, you shouldn't keep it. It's dangerous." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Dangerous for whom, Mrs. Ellison? For those who profited from his arrangements, or for those who feared being cut out of them?" Mrs. Ellison's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked at Mrs. Durrant, and in that glance Miss Marple saw confirmation enough. The two women were linked in this business, whether as allies or adversaries. The third knock came precisely at 8:30. Cyril Troughton entered with a smile that was far too bland to be sincere. "Ladies," he said with a slight bow, "I believe Miss Marple wished to see me." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I thought it might be useful to have everyone present. The ledger, you see, names each of you." All three reacted at once. Mrs. Ellison with a gasp, Mrs. Durrant with a stiffening of the spine, and Troughton with a narrowing of the eyes. "Names us?" he said lightly. "Surely that's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple's tone was still mild, but her eyes were bright. "The amounts differ, of course. Mr. Troughton, yours is the largest, which perhaps explains your haste in sending certain papers to Bristol. Mrs. Ellison, yours is modest, but enough to allow for a comfortable move to Torquay. And Mrs. Durrant, yours is precisely the value of the cottage you feared losing." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Mrs. Durrant said quietly, "Fisk wasn't supposed to keep records." We agreed. No paper trail. But he liked to be in control. "And control," Miss Marple said softly, "is something people will kill to keep or to prevent others from keeping." Troughton's mask of blandness slipped for an instant, revealing something colder beneath. "You can't prove anything." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple agreed. "But the thing about ledgers is that they tell their own story, even when those in them refuse to speak. And villages, Mr. Troughton, have a way of supplying the missing pages." She let them go one by one, each leaving with their own calculation of how much she truly knew. As the door closed behind the last of them, Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The trap was not yet sprung, but the bait was well and truly in place. Tomorrow, she thought, someone would make the next move, and she would be watching. The next morning dawned with a brittle kind of brightness, the air clear but edged with a chill that hinted at the turn of the season. St. Mildred's seemed deceptively peaceful, though Miss Marple knew from long experience that such a stillness often preceded a stir. Somewhere in the village, one or more people would have spent a restless night, mulling over her words, wondering how much she truly knew about Lionel Fisk's ledger and what she might do with it. She took her tea at the small table by her window, pretending to read the gardening notes in the local paper, but in reality watching the lane. It did not take long before her vigilance was rewarded. At 8:30, Mrs. Ellison emerged from her house with a parcel under her arm and an uncharacteristic swiftness to her step. She did not go toward the baker's shop as she usually did at that hour, but instead took the footpath toward the allotments, a path that, conveniently, passed near the back of Miss Marple's garden. Miss Marple rose without hurry, taking a small basket as though to gather herbs, and moved to the far end of her property, where the privet hedge concealed a narrow view of the path. Through a gap in the leaves, she saw Mrs. Ellison glance about, then crouch to push the parcel deep into a tangle of brambles behind the allotment shed. When the woman had gone, Miss Marple waited a prudent 5 minutes before making her own unhurried way to the spot. The brambles yielded their catch reluctantly, but the parcel came free at last. It was wrapped in oilcloth, tied neatly with twine. Back in her kitchen, she undid the layers to reveal a bundle of papers. Copies of the Meadows valuation plans, identical in layout to the burned fragments Reed had shown her. But these were intact. And across the top sheet was a faint smudge of the same blue pollen she had noticed on the sleeves of Braithwaite's coat. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her lips pursed. This was no coincidence. Whoever had placed that sprig of larkspur in the strong box had also handled these papers. It confirmed her growing belief that the flower had been a signature of sorts, a mark left either in pride or defiance. She rewrapped the parcel and returned it to its hiding place, ensuring it looked as though it had not been disturbed. Better to let Mrs. Ellison believe it was still safe. It would keep her actions predictable. At mid-morning, Constable Reed appeared at Miss Marple's gate, hat in hand. He looked tired and faintly exasperated. "I'm beginning to think this case will send me to the doctor for nerves," he confessed. "Every time I think I've got a lead, it turns out to be another dead end. Braithwaite swears he never left the manor that afternoon, though I've a witness says otherwise. And Mrs. Durrant's story hasn't changed, but it doesn't feel right." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "a story does not change precisely because it has been prepared too well. A genuine account is often messy in the small details. The tidier it is, the more I find myself mistrusting it." Reed gave a short laugh. "You've a way of making things sound so simple, Miss Marple. If you were in my position, where would you look next?" She considered him over her spectacles. "I should look, Constable, not for where people were, but for where they were not. An absence can be as telling as a presence. Who was expected somewhere that afternoon and failed to appear?" He frowned, then nodded slowly. "I'll think on that." When Reed had gone, Miss Marple took her knitting into the front garden. She had barely settled into her chair before Mrs. Bloom bustled up, eyes alight with the latest. "You'll never guess who I saw walking together early this morning. Mrs. Durrant and Mr. Troughton. Down by the canal path, mind you, where they thought no one would see, and looking as though they were arguing fit to burst." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, counting her stitches. "Did you hear any of it?" "Not the words, no. But the tone, sharp as a knife. And just before they parted, she pointed her finger at him as if warning him. Then off they went in opposite directions." Miss Marple nodded to herself. People under strain often made the mistake of meeting in secret, without considering who might be about early in the day. And if Mrs. Durrant and Troughton were at odds, it suggested that whatever arrangement they had shared with Fisk was now fracturing under the strain of his death and the uncertainty of the ledger's fate. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Lady Braithwaite again, this time without jam or other pretext. She found the lady in the drawing room, looking over some correspondence. "My dear lady," Miss Marple began in her most apologetic tone, "I fear I may be intruding, but I was thinking about poor Mr. Fisk, and wondered, do you happen to know who had keys to the gatehouse?" Lady Braithwaite set down her letters. "Only Lionel, of course, and my husband, naturally. Mrs. Durrant may have had one in the estate office, though I can't be certain." "And perhaps the surveyor?" Miss Marple asked innocently. The lady frowned. "I suppose it's possible, but I can't think why he'd need it. He could have arranged to meet Lionel there." Miss Marple left a few minutes later, apparently satisfied, but her mind was busy. If Mrs. Durrant had access to a key, then she could have entered before Fisk arrived, arranged the scene, and waited. That would explain the lack of signs of forced entry, and it would fit with Alfie's account of hearing voices before the shout. As the evening drew in, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the gatehouse. She noticed a faint scrape on the inside of the gatepost, recent by the look of it, at a height that suggested something metallic had been swung or carried through in haste. A padlock, perhaps. She smiled faintly. Small things, always small things. When she returned home, she found an envelope pushed under her door. This one was different from the anonymous note she had received earlier. The hand was firm, deliberate. Inside was a single sheet with 5 words written in black ink. "Meet me by the bridge." There was no time given, but Miss Marple knew enough to assume it meant that night, under cover of darkness. She considered ignoring it. Such meetings could be dangerous. But curiosity and the promise of a revealing slip were too tempting. At 9:30, she set out, her pace slow but steady, and reached the old stone bridge over the brook that marked the far edge of the village. The moon was a thin sickle, just enough light to see by. She waited, hearing only the water below and the faint rustle of leaves. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mrs. Ellison, her face pale, eyes darting. "I had to come," she whispered. "I can't sleep thinking about it. Fisk wasn't supposed to be there that early. Someone sent for him before your Mr. Braithwaite did. And when he arrived, he found her there already. She had the papers in her hand. He tried to take them back, and she pushed him. It wasn't meant to kill him, but when he fell..." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "And who was she, Mrs. Ellison?" Mrs. Ellison's lips trembled. "Mrs. Durrant. I saw her come out. She didn't see me. I was down by the hedge. She had the coat on and the flower in her hand. She dropped it when she put the papers in her bag." Miss Marple let the silence stretch. "And yet you hid copies of those same papers yourself." Mrs. Ellison's chin came up, defiant now. I thought they might be worth something. Insurance. But if you have that ledger, Miss Marple, then you know they'd do anything to get it back." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she thought, they would. And now the circle was narrowing. Mrs. Durrant had motive, opportunity, and a witness, albeit a reluctant one. All that remained was to draw the threads together in a way that even Constable Reed could not mistake. As Mrs. Ellison slipped away into the night, Miss Marple turned toward home, her mind already composing the quiet little gathering she would arrange for the next day. If all went as she intended, by tomorrow evening the truth of Lionel Fisk's death, and the matter of the meadow, would be laid bare in her own parlor. Morning found Miss Marple in her parlor with the curtains a fraction wider than usual, and the tea tray set out with mathematical neatness. The decisions of the night had settled into a tranquil readiness. It was not melodrama she wanted, merely a stage on which ordinary people would do the ordinary things that so reliably betrayed them. She sent 2 brief invitations by way of Alfie, one to Lady Braithwaite, couched as a request for guidance on the parish charity accounts, and one to Mrs. Durrant, suggesting that perhaps the housekeeper might help find a mislaid recipe card from last winter's fete. A 3rd note went to Mr. Troughton, politely asking if he would answer a small question regarding a subscription list he had handled for the same fete. Mrs. Ellison, she did not summon. Mrs. Ellison, Miss Marple knew, would arrive of her own accord once others were here. People like Mrs. Ellison feared being left out of conversations that might decide their fate. Before the clock struck 11, a soft knock announced Lady Braithwaite. She entered looking delicate but determined, the way women of her class manage distress, like a lace handkerchief valiantly stopping a flood. Miss Marple settled her with tea and gentle nothings until a brisk step and a sensible skirt heralded Mrs. Durrant. The housekeeper's eyes were sharp, her jaw set. She greeted her mistress with an automatic deference that seemed to cost her today. They were barely seated when Cyril Troughton's measured tread approached. And he came in with that smooth self-possession he wore in place of a conscience. He bowed to the ladies and took the chair that left his back to the window, so he could watch all their faces in the glass. A small, telling choice. "How kind of you all," Miss Marple said, her hands folded, her smile as guileless as a Sunday school picture. "It is really the most trifling matter. I am forever losing things, and yesterday I came upon something I had not expected to keep. Such a poor habit, keeping what is not one's own. I thought it best to ask the right people where it belongs." "And what precisely have you come upon?" Troughton asked lightly. "A small book," Miss Marple said, and allowed the words to fall like a feather onto a pond. "Bound in leather. The writing begins neat and grows rather firmer in later pages. One hesitates to use ugly names for useful tools, but some might call it a ledger. The stillness in the room acquired edges. Lady Braithwaite's fingers tightened on her cup. Mrs. Durrant's eyes went colder, not wider. Troughton's reflection in the window ceased its tiny adjustments. He went very still. "I don't see," Lady Braithwaite said carefully, "how such a thing could concern me." "It may not," Miss Marple said amiably, "though it is an awkward object to have at large. One hates to mislay people's names. They are such personal possessions." At that moment, the latch clicked and Mrs. Ellison slipped in with an apology that convinced no one. "Forgive me. I was passing. Miss Marple. I thought I might be of use, if you're speaking of parish subscriptions." She sat without being asked, producing the precise expression of a woman who intends to hear everything and be blamed for nothing. Miss Marple poured her tea as if replenishing courage. "What troubles me," she said, "is that I cannot tell to whom the little book most safely belongs. To the police, perhaps. But then the village would suffer a very public unhappiness. To its owner. But alas, he cannot take it. Or to the person most harmed by it. There is a school of thought," she added mildly, "that says evidence is a form of power and ought not to be left with those who misuse it." Troughton smiled. "One would have to decide first whether the book is genuine, if such a thing exists at all, which I rather doubt." "Do you?" Miss Marple's voice was soft curiosity. "I shouldn't. I think you have already posted a portion of its contents to Bristol." His eyes flicked, a betraying spark. "Idle supposition." "Oh, not idle," Miss Marple said. "Merely domestic. Postmasters do talk when a person has long been kind about Christmas puddings." She turned to Lady Braithwaite. "My lady, I wonder, you told me your husband kept to his room the afternoon Mr. Fiske died. But Mr. Larkin saw him walking down the lane just after 2:30. Lady Braithwaite flushed painfully. "If Mr. Larkin says so, then perhaps. My husband dislikes being contradicted. It is easier to repeat what he has said. But he did return at 3 for his nap, that I am certain." "How curious," Troughton said smoothly. "We are become a village of clocks." "Clocks are honest," Miss Marple murmured. "Unlike memory, they do not take sides." Mrs. Durrant set down her cup. "If you have a point, Miss Marple, you will oblige us by reaching it." "In a moment," Miss Marple said, with a benign nod. "I wondered whether anyone might help me with an object lesson. Constable Reed permitted me, after some scolding, to borrow the padlock from the gatehouse gate." She rose, fetched a parcel from a side table, and unwrapped the familiar iron lock. Its weight thudded softly on the cloth. A sensible thing for a gate. Very ordinary. Now, do you know, If one takes such a padlock by the hasp and swings, she demonstrated, not striking anything, merely letting the weight draw the loop through the air with a low, ugly hum. The head is so very vulnerable, and afterwards one hooks the lock back in its accustomed place and everything seems quite tidy. Lady Braithwaite caught her breath. Mrs. Ellison flinched. Troughton's mouth twisted, amused almost. Only Mrs. Durrant did not move. Her stillness was complete. Then she said, flat as a statement about weather, "You cannot know that happened." "No, not no," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But I think it. Because the sound Alfie heard, that metallic clatter, was not the lock, dropped from a hand, but the hasp striking stone and then being recaught by someone who could not risk leaving it, skew-whiff. People who pride themselves on order betray themselves by little tidyings. And this little morality play, Troughton said, would name which of us as the tidy murderer? "Ah," Miss Marple said, and the ah was a net being drawn. There we turned to the coat. The dark city coat that did not belong to Mr. Fiske. The coat was seen an hour before the fall on a woman whose sleeves were too long. The cuffs had blue pollen, as did the papers hidden by the allotment shed. And a sprig of larkspur was left in the strong box, which is a very sentimental gesture for an unromantic crime. I think it a signature. Someone's fancy of a warning, or perhaps an emblem of a lane they thought the world meant to change without their leave. All eyes went, as if on a string, to Mrs. Durrant. She met them without flinching. "If you accuse me, say so," she said. "I have no patience for embroidery." Miss Marple shook her head, the movement light. "I think you were there, Mrs. Durrant. I think you wore the coat to hide your dress and your hands, because cuffs that can be pushed back will conceal flour and polish, or garden dirt, or blood. I think you confronted Mr. Fiske with the proposition that the sale would not go forward as he planned. And I think you were very angry, but not a fool. You are not a woman to plan murder. Only when he reached, quick, proprietary, for the papers you had, you struck out with what was in reach. The lock, perhaps, from the table in the hall. And then, because you were tidy, you put it back." Lady Braithwaite made a small, broken sound. "Mrs. Durrant." "Oh, say it isn't so." The housekeeper's mouth trembled and then set hard. "I did not mean to kill him," she said, very low. "He would not listen. He said the cottage rows were inconvenient. He said my name." She stopped. "In a ledger," Miss Marple finished softly, "next to an amount equal to your cottage's value. A neat way to buy compliance. Only the neatness was not yours. It was done to you." Troughton gave a short, scornful laugh. "Oh, come now. We are villagers, not saints. Arrangements are made, compensations offered. Fiske was a practical man." "Practical men," Miss Marple said, "should refrain from hanging labels on people's dignity. You, Mr. Troughton, were to gain most by shepherding the legal work. You had copies of plans before anyone else. You sent papers to Bristol the day after the death, and you met Mrs. Durrant on the canal path this morning to urge her, not gently, I think, to keep her mouth shut." He spread his hands. "You ascribe to me a melodrama I have no time for." "And yet," Miss Marple went on, "there is one small thing you do have time for. You carry a pocket knife, not unusual, but yours has a fine, sharp awl for leather. Last evening I saw a faint new scrape inside the gatehouse gatepost. The kind a man makes when he pries a padlock staple slightly to seat it cleanly again. A woman who acts in shock would not think of that. A lawyer who pays court to order might. You arrived after Mr. Troughton. You set the scene straight. Troughton's gaze narrowed. And if I did? To neaten a place where a man has died is not a sin. To neaten is not, Miss Marple agreed. To destroy evidence is. She turned to Mrs. Ellison, who sat rigid as pastry left too long in the oven. Mrs. Ellison, you saw Mrs. Durrant leave the gatehouse. You hid copies of the plans yourself. But there is one thing only you know, and it will bear now. Mrs. Ellison swallowed. Her voice came out husky. When she came out, she had the papers. She dropped the flour, picking up her bag. I thought, well, if I kept a set, I could bargain. But then Mr. Braithwaite came this morning. Oh, Miss Marple, he threatened to see my husband ruined for debts if I didn't give him everything. I told him I knew nothing. Lady Braithwaite closed her eyes. God help me. Miss Marple let the silence hold. The room had entered that second stage of truth where people realized it would not be kept private and began choosing which portions to own. She spoke at last to Mrs. Durrant, her tone not accusing but grave. You struck him. He fell. You did not mean death. But the law is not always gentle with not meant. It might be gentler, though, if the manner of what came after were clearly not yours. Mrs. Durrant looked at her mistress, and for a moment a lifetime's service was in the look. My lady, she said, I would have told you. But there were the others, and Mr. Troughton said the police would not believe me if the book came out. The book will come out, Miss Marple said, but not to humiliate, to warn. Mr. Troughton, your packet to Bristol. What returns will be demanded for the courtesy of holding your copies? Favors stack. Men who keep such stacks topple when one piece is pulled. She turned to Lady Braithwaite, gentle again. My lady, your husband's coat. He went down to the gatehouse earlier and left it there when alarm rose. He will say he knew nothing. But he sent for Mr. Fisk at Kwart I Tre as ik en Klokke hal toe. That is a man who wishes to be both absent and in control. He must choose. Lady Braithwaite's voice shook. I shall speak to him. Yes, Miss Marple said. Constable Reed will need to be told too. But before he is, there is one small test I should like to perform. She rose and went to her writing desk, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the neatly wrapped brown paper parcel. She did not open it. Instead, she set it in the middle of the tea tray, as one might set a cake. The room's attention gathered about it like bees. This, she said, is a decoy, an empty parcel. But people betray themselves when what they fear most is within reach. I shall step into the kitchen for hot water. The tray will remain. I advise no one to touch what is not theirs. She left the door between parlor and hall ajar. In the tiny scullery she stood where a sliver of glass in the corner cupboard reflected the room, a trick of hers known only to the house. In that oblique mirror she watched the quartet, for Mrs. Ellison counted for two, with her fear and her hope. Troughton sat very still, lips pursed. Lady Braithwaite's hands were clasped white in her lap. Mrs. Durrant did not look at the parcel. She looked at her mistress's face. It was Mrs. Ellison whose eyes kept sliding back to the brown paper as if it might leap away. Twice her hand twitched. The third time, Troughton, without moving his head, said very softly, Don't. Miss Marple returned with the kettle, replete with innocence. There we are, she said, and set it down. How good everyone has been. Troughton smiled, but it was a brittle thing. Will you call your constable now, Miss Marple? Or do we sip and trade homilies until our virtue curdles? In a moment, Miss Marple said. There is a final little matter. The ledger is not in this house. It is already copied and placed where hands less careful than mine cannot fetch it. This was not yet true, but the truth would catch up within the hour. Whoever has been asking strangers to hold copies in Bristol may tell them to burn them. They will not. Such people keep two of everything. She looked at Mrs. Durrant. And you, my dear, must say exactly what you have done and nothing you have not. You struck him. You set down the lock. You left with the papers. You were seen. You did not remove embers from the ash bin to destroy what was left. That was another hand. Mrs. Durrant drew a breath that sounded like a decision. Yes, she said. I will tell Reed. And I, Lady Braithwaite said in a small but steady voice, will tell him what my husband did, and did not do. There may be some mercy for ignorance, but not for cowardice. Troughton rose, very urbane. Before we all throw ourselves upon the altars of confession, allow me to remark that there is not a scrap of proof of any of this that would stand in court. Miss Marple smiled, and it was no longer entirely sweet. Proof is coming on two legs. She glanced toward the door, and right on cue there was a quick knock and Alfie's cap appeared, followed by Constable Reed, who looked as if he had run. Behind him stood young Mr. Larkin, cheeks red, clutching a small wrapped bundle. Beg your pardon, ladies and gents, Reed said, breathless. But Mr. Larkin here thought better of something. Says he was paid yesterday to keep this safe and then to post it on Monday to an address in Bristol. He set the bundle on the table and peeled back the paper. Inside lay a sheaf of the same valuation copies, and on the top corner, in a small, lawyerly hand, a penciled index, C, 1 1/8 acres, D, cottage in fee, E, frontage strip, T, retainer. Troughton's control cracked. He took a step as if to snatch it and checked himself too late. Reed's hand was already there. Now then, sir, Reed said with a calm he had borrowed from Miss Marple, I think you and I had better talk. Miss Marple folded her hands and watched the eddies swirl. She had not yet pronounced guilt. That belonged to the law. But the village had been brought to the place where it must look at itself with its eyes open. In that, she felt, there was a measure of justice already. When the immediate tumult softened, Lady Braithwaite pale but resolute, Mrs. Durrant rigid with truth she had decided to carry, Mrs. Ellison weeping quietly as if tears could make fear dissolve. Miss Marple poured again and spoke as if resuming an ordinary call. We shall do best, she said, if we proceed in the right order, which is to say, first, the circumstances of Mr. Fisk's fall, as Mrs. Durrant knows them. Second, the disposition of papers, as Mr. Troughton arranged them. Third, the matter of inducements, to be returned where they are neither owed nor desired. After that, perhaps, the meadow can be spoken of by people who mean to live beside it. She looked down at her knitting basket and, quite without fuss, eased a folded piece of paper from beneath the wool. The true ledger pages were not there, but the gesture was enough to remind every eye in the room that secrets now lay above ground. It was a comfortless knowledge, perhaps, but it was honest. And in St. Mildred's, honesty was the only wealth that outlasted a season. The air in Miss Marple's parlor still seemed to hum with what had just passed. Constable Reed stood like a man holding a threadbare rug over a spilt jug of milk, knowing it would soak through unless he moved quickly. Troughton's expression had settled into that mask of urbane detachment that clever men adopt when they realize the ground has shifted under their feet. While Mrs. Durrant sat very straight, hands folded, a figure of rigid resolve. Mrs. Ellison dabbed at her eyes in little jerks, like a bird pecking seed. And Lady Braithwaite, though pale, had taken on the calm of someone who had finally decided to walk through a storm instead of waiting for it to pass. Reed cleared his throat. "Right," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'll have to take formal statements. The business of the papers and the other matters, well, we'll sort through that at the station." He glanced toward Miss Marple, as though hoping for a nod of reassurance. She merely smiled and took up the teapot again. "Tea before truth, Constable," she said softly. "The one settles the hands for the other." While Reed began noting down names, dates, and brief accounts, Miss Marple observed the small things. How Mrs. Durrant spoke with measured care, her voice firm when she admitted striking Fisk, but steady in denying any forethought. How Troughton's gaze flickered only when Reed asked about his contact in Bristol. How Mrs. Ellison hesitated when recounting her sighting of Mrs. Durrant leaving the gatehouse, as though reluctant to fix the memory too precisely. Lady Braithwaite, for her part, volunteered nothing about her husband unless asked directly, and even then her replies were clipped, stripped of any embellishment. When the formalities were done, Reed gathered the bundles of papers and the recovered parcel from Mr. Larkin, thanking the postmaster with a stiff politeness. "I'll secure these at the station," he said. Then, after a pause, "Miss Marple, if you'd, well, perhaps you might walk with me away, just to be sure I'm not missing something obvious." She agreed at once, leaving the others behind in a silence thick with things unsaid. Once they were out in the lane, Reed released a sigh that seemed to come from the soles of his boots. "It's a muddle, Miss Marple. A blow struck without meaning to kill, so she says, and then others stepping in to tidy, burn, and hide. Hard to pin it all neat for the law." Miss Marple walked at her usual steady pace. "Neatness, Constable, is not always the same as justice. The law will want its categories: manslaughter, accessory, obstruction, but the village will remember in quite a different order. They will remember who lied, who threatened, who took advantage, and perhaps, in the long run, that is the sterner judgment." Reed looked sideways at her. "And you? What's your judgment?" That Mr. Fisk's death was the spark, but the tinder had been laid long before. In the sale of the meadow, in the little bargains and compensations, in the assumption that certain people's wishes did not matter. When such things smolder, it takes only a careless match. At the crossroads, Reed left her with a promise to keep her informed. Miss Marple turned back toward the village, her eyes lingering on the neat frontages, the climbing roses, the larkspur nodding in the breeze. Pretty, she thought. How people plant beauty along the very hedges they hide behind. By the time she reached her garden gate, Mrs. Bloom was waiting there, arms folded, her expression bright with the effort of not seeming curious. "Morning, Miss Marple. I hear there's been quite the meeting at your house." "1 or 2 visitors," Miss Marple said mildly. "The Kettles had a busy morning." Mrs. Bloom's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing. Saw Mr. Troughton go by earlier with a face like thunder. And Mrs. Durrant, walking straight as a poker, headed for the vicarage. Said she had business there, but I doubt it was to discuss hymn numbers." Miss Marple only smiled. People do sometimes seek the vicar when their conscience needs company. That afternoon, the village seemed to ripple with half-heard phrases and glances exchanged across shop counters. It was the kind of day when the post office bell rang more often for gossip than for stamps, and Miss Marple knew the story was already sprouting new embellishments. Some would insist Mrs. Durrant had confessed to murder outright. Others would whisper that Troughton had tried to bribe the constable. Truth, as always, would find itself elbowed into a corner, while rumor took the center of the room. Toward evening, Lady Braithwaite came alone to Miss Marple's door. She was still pale, but there was a steadiness to her manner. "I thought you ought to know," she said once seated, "that I've spoken to my husband. He denies all knowledge, of course, but he will step back from the matter of the meadow. I shall see to it myself. There will be no sale, at least not to the parties Mr. Fiske intended. I owe that much to Mrs. Durrant." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is a kindness, my lady, and a prudence. A development that begins in deceit seldom prospers in daylight." Lady Braithwaite hesitated. "Do you think she will be sent away?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the law will look at her years of service, at her intent, and at the fact that she did not seek to profit from what she did. Whether she stays here may depend as much on the village's capacity for forgiveness as on the magistrate's decision." When her visitor had gone, Miss Marple sat in the quiet, listening to the small creaks of the house settling for the night. She thought of Mrs. Durrant's rigid back, of Troughton's flickering gaze, of Mrs. Ellison's twitching hands. She thought of the little ledger, now in safe keeping, and of the sprig of larkspur that had lain in the strong-box, a symbol, perhaps, of one woman's attempt to claim some piece of a world being altered without her consent. The following day, Constable Reed returned with an update. "Troughton's been called in for further questioning. The Bristol contact's been traced, property developer with a taste for backdoor deals. Between that and the recovered papers, we've enough to tie him to the attempted cover-up. As for Mrs. Durrant, the inspector's inclined to recommend leniency. Manslaughter, perhaps, with a strong plea for mitigation." Miss Marple nodded. "That is as I thought. It will not undo what has been done, but it may prevent further harm." Reed gave a small, rueful smile. "You've a way of making sense of the mess, Miss Marple. I don't know how you do it." "It is only a matter of watching," she said simply. "People tell you who they are, Constable. If not in their words, then in their hands, their silences, the little tidinesses they cannot help but make." After he left, she took her knitting out into the garden. The lane was quiet again, the only movement the bob of larkspur in the warm breeze. She wondered how long it would be before St. Mildred's returned to its accustomed peace. Outwardly, at least. Inwardly, she suspected, the ripples from the Larkspur Lane business would take much longer to still. As the church clock struck 6, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and looked down the lane. Mrs. Durrant was walking slowly toward the manor, her head high, as though she had decided that the best way to face her neighbors was to do so openly. Across the way, Mrs. Ellison stood in her doorway, watching, then gave the smallest of nods before retreating inside. It was not reconciliation, not yet. But it was the beginning of something other than enmity. And in a place like St. Mildred's, beginnings, Miss Marple knew, were sometimes more important than endings. She rose, went inside, and closed the door softly behind her. The Larkspur Lane Enigma had, in its own untidy way, been resolved. And as she returned to her chair, she thought, not without a trace of dry amusement, that in villages, as in gardens, it was often the smallest, least noticeable things that determined what would thrive and what would wither away. The Sunday following the events had that peculiar stillness that only a village after a scandal possesses. The church bell tolled across St. Mildred's in its usual unhurried cadence, but the congregation it called together was taut with curiosity. People arrived earlier than usual, lingering near the lich gate in little knots of talk, each group breaking apart the moment another approached, like drops of water skittering on a hot pan. Miss Marple, in her neat straw hat and dove-gray coat, made her way up the path with the quiet certainty of a woman whose presence in church was as habitual as the bell itself. She greeted the vicar, exchanged polite nods with the Braithwaites, and noted, without staring, that Mrs. Durrant was in her accustomed pew behind the Braithwaite family, her posture perfectly correct. The housekeeper's head was held high, though her hands clasped the service book tightly enough to blanch the knuckles. In the rear, Mr. Troughton took a seat apart from his usual cronies. He appeared absorbed in his prayer book, but turned a page far too often, a restless movement that told Miss Marple he was enduring the service rather than attending to it. Mrs. Ellison was in her place beside her husband, her glances darting more to the aisle than toward the altar. The vicar, whether by accident or design, chose for his sermon a passage on the parable of the talents, about stewardship, honesty, and the moral weight of what is entrusted to us. More than once, Miss Marple saw faces shift uncomfortably, as though the message had been sharpened to a point and aimed directly at certain pews. After the service, the usual procession to the churchyard for polite exchanges began. Though there was a distinct undercurrent to it today. Mrs. Bloom was quick to attach herself to Miss Marple's elbow, lowering her voice though every syllable carried. "So, it's all but settled, I hear." The constables had Troughton in for hours these past few days. And Mrs. Durrant, well, they say she'll not be leaving the manor unless it's her own choice. I can't say I'm sorry. She's always been fair to me when it came to the Christmas boxes. Miss Marple made a small, non-committal sound. Kindness has a way of leaving deeper marks than unkindness, Mrs. Bloom. People remember both, but one they forgive more easily. They parted at the gate, and Miss Marple walked home along Larkspur Lane. The day was fine enough to bring out the scent of the roses, mingling with the sharp green note of the larkspur that still nodded along the hedges. She paused at her own gate to take in the quiet scene, so very like the one she had observed before it all began, and yet altered, in ways only the observant would note. Later that afternoon, Lady Braithwaite called again, this time without formality. She was plainly dressed, her hat in her hands, and her eyes looked more tired than before, though there was a steadiness behind them. "I wanted to thank you," she began once Miss Marple had settled her in the parlor, "not only for unraveling it all, but for making sure it was done with the least harm possible. My husband has agreed to let the meadow, not sell it. It will bring in some income without changing the village beyond recognition. I believe that will satisfy most." "That is sensible," Miss Marple said, "and fairness is often the best preventative for trouble. People rarely resort to desperate measures when they believe their grievances have been heard." Lady Braithwaite gave a small smile. "Mrs. Durrant will remain with us, at least for now. I told her the choice was hers. She wishes to stay. I am glad. I have grown accustomed to her ways." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Habit is a form of loyalty, my lady, though one must be sure it rests on solid ground." When her guest had gone, Miss Marple took a walk toward the gatehouse, partly to stretch her legs, partly to see for herself how the place looked now that the police had concluded their work. The padlock hung again in its place, its iron dull in the late afternoon sun. The gravel had been raked, and the doorway swept clean, though the faint scrape inside the gatepost still marked where metal had brushed against it. A small detail, invisible to most, but to her it was the last faint shadow of the truth. On her way back, she encountered Constable Reed, coming from the opposite direction with a bundle of papers under his arm. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, smiling. "Thought I'd tell you. Troughton's to be charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and attempted fraud. The developer in Bristol has already given a statement. As for Mrs. Durrant, the magistrates taking a lenient view, as we hoped. She'll be bound over to keep the peace, no prison." "I am glad to hear it," Miss Marple said. "Punishment should be proportionate to the wrong, and she is not a woman likely to offend again." Reed nodded. "Mrs. Ellison's been left out of it, officially. No charges. But I think she'll be keeping her head down for a while." They parted with mutual goodwill, and Miss Marple continued home. She was not one to glory in the outcome of her cases. Resolution, in her view, was less a matter for triumph than for quiet satisfaction that the world had been set to rights as far as it could be. That evening, she took her tea in the garden. The sun was dipping low, sending long bars of gold across the neat beds. Somewhere down the lane, a child laughed. A dog barked twice, and then fell silent. The village, she thought, was breathing easier again. Not untouched, never untouched, but easier. Her thoughts wandered over the past days. The sudden cry from the gatehouse, the flurry of gossip, the careful listening, the weighing of motives against opportunities, the slow, inexorable knitting together of facts until they formed a pattern. It was not unlike her needlework. Start with a tangle, and work until the threads lay smooth. As she reached for her knitting basket, her fingers brushed against the folded scrap of paper she had kept from the ledger. One small page with no names, only the initials and figures. She had decided to keep it as a reminder, not of the crime, but of the chain of small decisions and smaller deceits that had led to it. Crimes, she knew, were rarely born full-grown. They sprouted from seeds planted long before, in soil made fertile by pride, resentment, and the comforting belief that no one was watching. But someone always was. The next morning brought ordinary concerns again. Milk to be fetched, the vicar's wife asking after her advice on the flower rota, Mrs. Bloom debating whether the jumble sale should be moved indoors in case of rain. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, the shock of recent events fading into the background hum of village life. Yet beneath it, Miss Marple knew, there lingered a sharper awareness among the villagers. That even here, behind the hedges and under the church spire, people were capable of folly and harm, and that such things left traces, however well one tried to tidy them away. In the weeks that followed, the meadow was mown and let to a local farmer who grazed sheep there. Mrs. Durrant kept to her duties, neither shunned nor embraced more than before. But Miss Marple noted that her exchanges with the neighbors had a new politeness, as though each side recognized the other's boundaries more clearly. Mr. Troughton's cottage, in contrast, went shuttered. Rumor had it he intended to sell and move to the city once the case was done. Mrs. Ellison resumed her work at the bakery, but was noticeably quieter. Her once eager participation in gossip replaced by a more guarded air. One bright Saturday morning, as Miss Marple sat at her garden table enjoying a pot of tea, Alfie came by on his bicycle, slowing to pass her gate. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called. "Everything quiet again, eh?" She smiled at him over her spectacles. "For the moment, Alfie. But that's the thing about villages. Quiet is only ever borrowed, never bought." He laughed and pedaled on, and Miss Marple returned to her tea, her gaze resting for a moment on the larkspur blooming at the lane's bend. Beautiful, fragile-looking things, yet with roots deep enough to hold their place year after year, through all the storms and sunshine alike. And so Larkspur Lane returned to its gentle rhythms, its hedges neat, its gardens bright, its secrets tucked away again. But Miss Marple, with her needles clicking softly in the evening light, knew that somewhere another seed of trouble might already be germinating, unnoticed by most, but never entirely unseen by her. It was 3 weeks later, on an afternoon of bright, restless wind, when Miss Marple realized the business of Larkspur Lane was not quite finished after all. The official matters had been settled, Mr. Troughton remanded for trial, Mrs. Durrant bound over, the meadows safely let. Yet there was still, for Miss Marple, an unsettled corner in the pattern, a faint gap in the weave of events that nagged at her mind like a dropped stitch she could not leave alone. The source of that irritation came to her in the form of a chance remark from Mrs. Bloom. Miss Marple was returning from the post office when she met the older woman emerging from the drapers, carrying a small parcel and full of her usual news. "They say," Mrs. Bloom began, lowering her voice in the way of people who want to be overheard, "that Mrs. Ellison's sister from Torquay is coming to stay a few days. Funny time for it, with all that's been going on. And funny thing, Mrs. Ellison's been drawing more from the bank than she earns. Now, I don't pry, but the girl at the counter told me she's been changing it into postal orders. For what, I wonder?" Miss Marple, hiding her interest behind a pleasant smile, murmured something about family obligations and let Mrs. Bloom carry on her way. But the idea stayed with her all through luncheon. Postal orders meant money sent somewhere, and usually for something one did not wish to be traced to one's account. That, in turn, reminded her of the parcel Alfie had recovered from Mr. Larkin, bound for Bristol. She fetched her notebook, a simple thing, its pages crowded with neat, small script, and turned to the entries she had made during the case. Yes, the Bristol contact had been tied to Troughton, but nothing had ever proved conclusively that he alone had been sending material there. Could Mrs. Ellison, in her desire for insurance, have been corresponding with the same parties? And if so, was she now paying them for silence, or for some promise of protection? The matter required a little light thrown on it, and Miss Marple, as always, preferred her light to be indirect. That afternoon, she strolled into the bakery for a small purchase, lingering at the counter while Mrs. Ellison fetched her change. "How pleasant," Miss Marple said, "to hear your sister will be visiting. Such a journey, though. Will she be traveling by train all the way from Torquay?" Mrs. Ellison hesitated just long enough for Miss Marple to note it. Yes, that's the way. She likes the train. And I suppose she'll enjoy seeing the meadow before it changes. Though I do hear it's to be sheep this year. Such gentle creatures." The other woman's eyes flickered. "Yes. Sheep? Well, we'll see." And she wrapped the change with rather more force than necessary. It was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion. Mrs. Ellison still had some stake in the business, and it was a stake she preferred no one else to notice. The following morning, Miss Marple sent Alfie with a note to Mr. Larkin at the post office, asking him to step by for tea. When he arrived, she greeted him warmly, poured generously, and then remarked, almost as an afterthought, "I was wondering, Mr. Larkin, whether you've seen much of Mrs. Ellison lately at your counter." He chuckled. "More than usual, Miss Marple. Comes in twice a week, always with the same request. Postal orders to an address in Exeter. Always the same handwriting on the form, too. Funny thing, though, it's not her own. And the amount? Not much, £1 or £2 each time. But regular as clockwork, like paying for a subscription." Miss Marple thanked him, and after he left, she sat with her knitting idle in her lap, considering. Exeter was not Bristol, but it was a large enough place to hide many kinds of business, and the small, regular sums suggested a drip feed of money for service, or for silence. 2 days later, an opportunity came in the form of Lady Braithwaite's garden tea, to which half the lane had been invited. Miss Marple, positioned in the shade with a clear view of the gathering, noted that Mrs. Ellison was uncharacteristically subdued, speaking little and glancing often toward the gate. When it opened to admit the afternoon postman with a bundle of letters, Mrs. Ellison's head lifted at once. She took her envelope quickly, tucking it away without opening it, and left soon after, pleading the need to see to the oven. Miss Marple waited a polite interval, then excused herself, taking the same route home. As she turned into the narrow lane by the allotments, she saw Mrs. Ellison ahead, stepping into her doorway. Under her arm was the same kind of long, slim envelope the post office used for recorded items. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Durrant at the manor under the pretext of returning a borrowed cookery book. In the kitchen, over a cup of tea, she mentioned casually, "I believe Mrs. Ellison has been keeping herself busy with letters these days." Mrs. Durrant gave a short, sharp laugh. "Letters? Huh. More like making sure certain people keep quiet. She thinks she's clever, sending them through a cousin in Exeter so they don't go straight to Bristol. But she's only as clever as the people she's dealing with, and they'll turn on her soon enough." "Do you know who they are?" Mrs. Durrant shook her head. "Names don't matter. It's the kind of men who live off other people's fears. Fisk knew them. Troughton knew them. Now she's trying to play their game." Miss Marple went home thoughtful. This, she realized, was the last loose thread. Mrs. Ellison's insurance had not been destroyed with the rest of Troughton's schemes. It was still in play, a dangling hook in the waters of the village. 2 mornings later, she took a decisive step. She sent Alfie again to Mrs. Ellison's with a message that Miss Marple would like a word about something delicate. It was the kind of summons few could resist. Mrs. Ellison arrived promptly, her expression wary. "My dear," Miss Marple began, "you were kind enough, during the matter of poor Mr. Fisk, to share what you saw at the gatehouse. That was of great help to the constable. But I wonder if you realize that the same people you may be corresponding with now could very easily decide you are more trouble than profit." Mrs. Ellison colored. "I don't know what you mean." "On the contrary, you do. You've been sending money to Exeter, and before that you were hiding papers from the gatehouse. You thought it a wise precaution, and perhaps it seemed so at the time. But such arrangements have a way of turning into chains, and those chains can be yanked very sharply indeed." The woman's shoulders sagged. "What am I to do then? If I stop, they might tell things that would ruin me." "My dear, I believe the time for them to tell such things has passed. The village has moved on. The police have their chief culprits. If you stop feeding the cat, it will go elsewhere for milk. I should suggest you do exactly that, and make no reply to whatever comes after." Mrs. Ellison looked doubtful but promised at last to think on it. Over the next fortnight, Miss Marple observed quietly. The postman no longer delivered recorded envelopes to Mrs. Ellison's door, and her manner began to ease, though she still crossed the street to avoid Troughton's shuttered cottage. The rumor mill, deprived of new fuel, turned back to its usual diet of petty quarrels and garden competitions. One afternoon, sitting in her garden with the larkspur nodding blue in the breeze, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh of contentment. The final loose stitch had been worked in, the pattern complete. Yet she knew, as she always did, that peace in St. Mildred's was never permanent. Somewhere, someone would plant another seed, of vanity, of greed, of resentment, and in time, it would sprout. And when it did, she would be here, knitting quietly in her chair, watching the lane and waiting for the moment when the smallest of details would once again open the door to the whole truth. That, she thought, was the true nature of her work. Not grand revelations or courtroom drama, but the patient tending of a garden, weeding out the nettles before they could choke the roses, and seeing to it that the lane, with all its foibles and follies, remained, at least on the surface, the tranquil place the world believed it to be. A month later, Larkspur Lane seemed almost to have lulled itself into believing the past summer's events had been no more than an unpleasant dream. The roses on the cottage fronts had gone to hips, the larkspur was browning to seed, and the afternoons carried the first cool breath of autumn. But Miss Marple knew that what had happened had settled deep into the fabric of the village. Even if most people had folded the memory away in a mental drawer or they preferred not to open. She noticed it in the way Mrs. Durrant carried herself when she came to the greengrocer's, still upright and efficient, but with a reserve that discouraged chatter. It was there in the fact that Mrs. Ellison no longer lingered at her gate to pass the time of day, but kept her eyes lowered and her errands brisk. Even Lady Braithwaite, while unfailingly cordial, spoke with a carefulness that seemed to weigh each word before letting it leave her lips. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her habitual round, tending her garden, attending the church sewing circle, and taking her daily walks. Yet her mind remained tuned to the lane's quiet music, sensitive to its slightest dissonances. That was how she noticed, on a damp Tuesday morning, the figure of Mr. Braithwaite himself striding toward the gatehouse. He carried a bundle of papers under his arm and was glancing behind him in the way of a man who both expects and fears an audience. It was unusual to see him about without some public reason. Miss Marple's curiosity stirred. She took a short cut through the churchyard and arrived at the bend in the lane just in time to see him unlock the gatehouse door, disappear inside, and emerge again less than 2 minutes later without the bundle. She didn't approach him. Men like Mr. Braithwaite tended to bristle under direct scrutiny. But later that day, when she passed the gatehouse, she found the door secured and the curtains drawn. The only sign of recent activity was a faint smear of mud on the threshold, and the smell, just detectable, of fresh tobacco smoke. The following morning, Constable Reed stopped at her gate. "All quiet, Miss Marple?" he asked, though his tone was that of a man hoping to hear otherwise. "As quiet as it ever is," she replied. "Though Mr. Braithwaite was at the gatehouse yesterday. You might be interested to know." Reed frowned. "That's odd. There's no reason for him to be using it now. Papers have all been cleared out." "Or so you thought," Miss Marple said mildly. "It might be worth confirming." 2 days later, Reed reappeared, his expression wry. "You were right, of course. Found a locked tin in the back cupboard. Braithwaite's key fitted. Inside were copies of the valuation plans, the original ledger pages, and a few letters between Fisk and that Bristol developer. All kept back, I reckon, in case he decided to reopen the matter later." Miss Marple allowed herself a small nod. Men who dislike losing a game often keep a spare set of cards tucked away. The question, Constable, is whether he meant to play them again, or simply couldn't bear to part with them. Reed sighed. "Either way, I've warned him the material's now in police hands. He didn't like it." "That," said Miss Marple, "is often the case when people are relieved of burdens they think are treasures." The discovery stirred the village anew, though more quietly than before. Those who had begun to forget now found their conversations drifting back to the summer's scandal. Speculation about Mr. Braithwaite's intentions ran high. with some insisting he had meant to blackmail the others and others claiming he had merely been safeguarding his own interests. Miss Marple listened without adding fuel, though she kept her own counsel about the most likely truth. That Mr. Braithwaite's pride would never allow him to destroy anything that proved he had once been in control. One crisp afternoon, Lady Braithwaite came to call, wrapped in a well-cut coat and with a determined set to her chin. "Over tea," she confided. "My husband is put out. He feels you have turned the constable's attention upon him unfairly." Miss Marple met her gaze evenly. "My dear lady, I turned nothing. Constable Reed follows where the path leads. Your husband chose to keep certain items that were better destroyed. The constable's interest is the natural consequence." Lady Braithwaite hesitated. "I told him as much. But you know how he is. He will not admit a misstep. I only hope this will finally put the matter to rest." "I suspect," Miss Marple said, "that it will, if your husband allows it to. Sometimes the only way to keep a wound from reopening is to stop prodding it." The weeks that followed seemed to prove her right. Mr. Braithwaite kept to his estate affairs, Mrs. Durrant continued her work without further incident, and Mrs. Ellison settled into a quieter rhythm, her sister's visit having come and gone without fuss. The lane regained its surface serenity. One morning, as October sunlight slanted through thinning leaves, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table with her knitting and reflected on how the Larkspur Lane affair had unfolded. It had begun, as such things so often did, with something that seemed small. A cry from the gatehouse, a breathless boy, a scrap of village gossip. From there it had moved through layers of deception and self-interest, touching lives in ways that would not be easily erased. She thought of Mrs. Durrant, whose single moment of anger had set the whole chain of events in motion, yet who had not sought to profit from it. Of Troughton, whose smooth exterior had hidden a grasping greed. Of Mrs. Ellison, who had tried to hedge her bets and found herself caught in the very net she'd hoped to avoid. And of Mr. Braithwaite, still reluctant to give up the symbols of control even when keeping them risked exposure. In each case, the crime had been shaped not only by circumstance, but by character. And character, Miss Marple knew, was the most reliable detective of all, if one took the time to watch it at work. That afternoon, she walked the length of Larkspur Lane, pausing to admire the gardens, to comment on the weather, to exchange a word or two with neighbors. It pleased her to see that, while the events of the summer had left their mark, they had not blighted the place. People were talking again, if more cautiously. Children were playing in the road. The church bell still chimed the hour. Life, as it always did, had flowed on. When she reached her gate, she looked back at the curve of the lane, where the last of the season's larkspur stood like blue pennants in the fading light. There was a certain poetry in their endurance, she thought. Beauty lingering in the very place that had seen discord. A reminder that trouble, no matter how stirring, was only ever part of the whole. Miss Marple went inside, set the kettle on, and laid her knitting in her lap. She had no doubt that in time, another puzzle would come along, perhaps weeks, perhaps months from now. And when it did, she would be here, quietly watching from her garden, letting the smallest of details tell her their story until the whole picture emerged. For that was her gift and her pleasure, not the drama of accusation or the noise of public judgment, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing the pattern clearly and setting it straight before it could twist itself into something worse. Outside, a breeze stirred the larkspur, carrying their faint, clean scent through the open window. Miss Marple breathed it in, the ghost of summer mingling with the crispness of autumn, and allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Larkspur Lane, she thought, was once again what it appeared to be, at least for now. And that, in a village, was as much as anyone could reasonably hope for. By early November, the village was wearing its winter face. Hedges bare of flowers, gardens stripped back to their bones, the afternoons shortening into swift dusks. Fires were being lit earlier in the day, and the smell of wood smoke lay in soft drifts over Larkspur Lane. Yet, beneath the calm routine of the season, Miss Marple still detected the faint reverberations of the summer's events. Some things, she knew, never quite settle into silence. They simply hum more quietly. She saw it in Mrs. Ellison, whose manner remained cautious, as though she feared a hand might tap her shoulder and remind her of things best left in the past. She saw it in Lady Braithwaite, who carried herself with the careful poise of a woman determined to keep her household steady despite fissures she could not quite repair. And she saw it, too, in Mrs. Durrant, who performed her duties with faultless competence, but had grown almost invisible, as though she had learned that safety lay in blending into the background. For Miss Marple, the affair had been laid to rest in the official sense. The constable's work was done, the charges brought, the court dates fixed. But there was one last curiosity, a matter that had not been crucial to the solving of the case, yet continued to tug at her thoughts like a loose thread. The sprig of larkspur left in the strongbox on the day of Lionel Fisk's death. It was, she had always felt, more than an idle flourish. A woman in shock or haste might drop something accidentally. A woman seeking to taunt or to make a point might place it deliberately. Mrs. Durrant had admitted to striking Fisk, but she had never claimed the larkspur as hers, and Miss Marple believed her. The flower, then, belonged to someone else. On a brisk Thursday afternoon, she found herself walking past Mrs. Bloom's garden, where the last hardy larkspur still swayed in a sheltered corner. Mrs. Bloom was cutting the stalks back for winter. "Such a pity to see them go," Miss Marple remarked, pausing at the gate. "They've done well this year," Mrs. Bloom said with satisfaction. "Had half the lane in here for cuttings in June. Mind you, some don't ask. They just help themselves." Miss Marple's brows rose. "Oh? Was that so?" Mrs. Bloom sniffed. "Caught Mrs. Ellison at it once. Reached right over the hedge, she did, with her flowery hands and all. Said she only wanted one for her kitchen vase, but larkspur's no good for indoors. It drops in a day. I told her so." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and went on her way, the image settling neatly into the pattern she had carried in her mind. A single sprig, taken for no practical reason. A woman who had been near the gatehouse, wearing Braithwaite's coat, the sleeves marked with blue pollen. Mrs. Durrant had not placed the flower. Mrs. Ellison had. Not as a signal, perhaps, but as a reflex. Tucking it away absently, only to set it down in the strongbox when it interfered with the handling of papers. A small, unconscious act, yet one that had left an oddly poetic calling card. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered whether to mention it to anyone. It would change nothing in the eyes of the law, but it completed the story for her own satisfaction. In the end, she decided to let it rest. Some truths, she knew, had more weight when left unspoken. As the weeks passed, the village's rhythm adapted to the earlier nights and longer firesides. On one such evening, Lady Braithwaite hosted a small gathering, nothing formal, just a handful of neighbors for sherry and conversation. Miss Marple attended, not out of any pressing desire for company, but because such gatherings were an excellent place to gauge the state of village relations. Mrs. Ellison was there, looking more at ease than Miss Marple had seen her in months. though still careful in her conversation. Mrs. Durrant served the refreshments with her usual quiet efficiency, never lingering long enough in one group to become part of its talk. Mr. Braithwaite remained largely silent, answering when addressed, but avoiding any topic that might touch upon the meadow or the gatehouse. The talk, inevitably, turned to the coming Christmas fete. Plans for the stalls were discussed, the raffle prizes debated, the placement of the tea urns argued over with cheerful obstinacy. Miss Marple noted who volunteered for what, who deferred, and who spoke up more than they used to. It was a small but telling sign that the lane was stitching itself back together. Slowly, unevenly, but with the same inevitability that pulled the seasons along. A few days later, as she walked back from the post office, Miss Marple was stopped by Constable Reed, who had a way of appearing when she least expected it. "All settled now, I think," he said. "Troughton's trial date's set for February. Should be straightforward. Developer's statement seals it." He hesitated. "You've a knack for these things, Miss Marple. Ever get the feeling we've missed something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There is always something we miss, Constable. But the question is whether it matters. In this case, I think what's left behind is more in the nature of a footnote than a chapter." Reed chuckled. "I'll take your word for it." When she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked down the curve of Larkspur Lane. The low sun gilded the hedge tops, and the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. The lane, she thought, had survived its upheaval much as it always had. Not unchanged, but still itself. In her sitting room, she laid aside her outdoor things and settled with her knitting, letting her mind drift over the whole affair one final time. She thought of the initial cry at the gatehouse, the rush of footsteps, the swirl of speculation that had followed. She thought of the ledger, the coat, the padlock, the flower, and all the small betrayals that had combined to end in a man's death. And she thought, with a private satisfaction, that she had done what she always aimed to do: bring the truth into the open just far enough to restore a measure of balance, without tearing more of the fabric than necessary. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest rattle of the last larkspur stalks in Mrs. Bloom's garden. Miss Marple smiled to herself, and her needles clicked softly on. The case of Larkspur Lane, she decided, could finally be folded away. Not forgotten, for nothing was ever truly forgotten here, but placed in that quiet mental drawer alongside all the other puzzles she had untangled over the years. Somewhere in the village, she knew, another thread was already being spun. Another small event that might, in time, draw her quiet attention. And when it did, she would be here, watching, ready to follow it to its end. However tangled the path, however small the clues. For that was her way, and Larkspur Lane was, after all, a place that always rewarded the watcher. The first snow of December came softly to St. Mildred's, drifting down in lazy flakes that settled on the lane's rooftops and softened the sharp edges of hedges and walls. It was not a deep snow, just enough to hush the world and make footsteps sound unusually loud on the narrow pavements. Miss Marple, standing at her window with a cup of tea, watched it gather in the crooks of the larkspur stalks she had left uncut, their seed heads now wearing delicate white caps. It was a curious thing, she reflected, how the lane seemed to take on an almost innocent look under a dusting of snow. The summer's troubles might never have happened. The quarrels, the scheming, the fear all seemed impossible to imagine against this quiet, white backdrop. And yet, she knew very well they had happened, and the marks they left were not so easily erased as footprints in slush. The Christmas fete, long in planning, went ahead on the Saturday before the holiday. The church hall was warm with the smell of pine boughs and hot mince pies, and the tables were bright with handmade goods, preserves, and small ornaments. Miss Marple, in her role as honorary judge of the cake competition, moved quietly among the stalls, exchanging greetings and noting, as she always did, the subtle choreography of who spoke to whom and who avoided whose eyes. Mrs. Ellison was there, helping at the tea stall, her manner almost, though not quite, her old self. She chatted politely with Mrs. Bloom, who returned the courtesy. But Miss Marple noticed that neither woman lingered in the other's company. Mrs. Durrant, on the other hand, had been persuaded to take charge of the raffle table, a position that kept her busy and firmly in the center of things. She seemed more at ease than before, perhaps finding comfort in the simple, structured tasks of village life. Even Mr. Braithwaite attended, though he stayed only an hour, making a circuit of the stalls with Lady Braithwaite on his arm. His expression was perfectly pleasant, but Miss Marple noted the small tightening of his jaw when his glance fell on Mrs. Durrant. It was a look, she thought, of a man who would never entirely forgive a loss, even if he dared not reopen the battle. The raffle was drawn, the cakes judged, the last of the tea poured. As the evening came on, Miss Marple stepped out into the cold air, the hall's lights spilling warm and gold onto the snow. She walked home slowly, listening to the muffled quiet of the lane. Through curtained windows, she glimpsed the flicker of hearth fires, the silhouette of a family gathered to eat, the shadow of a cat leaping up to a windowsill. At her own gate, she paused to look down the curve of the lane. It was a view she had seen in all seasons and under all moods, bright with summer bloom, bare in winter frost, muddied in spring rain. And she thought how each season's beauty was only deepened by the memory of what had gone before. The larkspur, the meadow, the gatehouse. Each was now part of the lane's quiet history, not spoken of openly but woven into its undercurrent of shared knowledge. Inside, she set down her coat and hat, lit the small fire in her sitting room, and took her place with her knitting. As the needles clicked in their familiar rhythm, her mind wandered briefly to that first afternoon's cry, the hurried steps, the murmur of gossip spreading along the lane. So much had unfolded from so small a beginning. And yet, she thought, it had not been the dramatic moments. The confrontation in the meadow, the search of the gatehouse, the courtroom summons, that had truly solved the puzzle. It had been the small things. A muddy smear on a threshold, the wrong kind of coat for the weather, a sprig of larkspur tucked away without thought. The human details, unnoticed by most, had told her the story long before anyone else could see it. The fire crackled, and outside the snow continued to fall in fine, steady flakes, wrapping the lane in quiet. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The matter of Larkspur Lane was finished now, finished in the way that such matters ever were, leaving the people changed, but the place itself much the same. She picked up her teacup, sipped, and thought, not without a touch of wry amusement, that there would be other cries in the lane, other hurried steps, other puzzles spun from the same familiar threads of pride, vanity, and fear. And when they came, she would be ready, as she always was, to watch, to listen, and to see the pattern long before anyone else could. The snow lay deeper now, softening the world into silence. Somewhere down the lane, a door closed gently. Somewhere else, a clock struck the hour. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch as she listened, not to the sound, but to the sense of the lane itself, calm and whole again, at least for a while. In the quiet days after the fete, with Christmas approaching, St. Mildred seemed to settle into its winter routine. The snow had melted into crisp frost. The mornings were edged in silver, and the lane wore an almost fragile peace. But Miss Marple knew a case was never truly over until every shadow in its corners had been examined. And there was one shadow, faint but persistent, that still troubled her. It was the matter of Mrs. Ellison's Larkspur. Miss Marple had chosen to leave it unspoken at the time, knowing it wouldn't alter the official outcome. Yet in her mind, the little flower had remained like a bookmark, marking a place where the truth wasn't yet fully told. She had no wish to expose Mrs. Ellison to scandal again, but equally, she disliked an untied thread. And so, on a frosty afternoon, she invited the woman to tea. The parlor was warm, the fire bright, and Miss Marple had laid out her best china. They spoke at first of ordinary things, the weather, the fete, the price of sugar, before Miss Marple said gently, "My dear, do you remember the day you went to the gatehouse wearing Mr. Braithwaite's coat?" Mrs. Ellison froze with her cup halfway to her lips. Yes, I told you about that." "You did, but you didn't tell me about the Larkspur, the one you had tucked into your pocket and left behind in the strong-box." The color rose in Mrs. Ellison's cheeks. "Oh, I'd forgotten that." She set down her cup, hands trembling. "It was nothing. I'd taken it from Mrs. Bloom's garden on the way. I like the flowers, you see, but I didn't mean... It wasn't some sort of sign, if that's what you think." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "No, I never thought it was a sign. I thought it was a habit, a little thoughtless action that happened to leave a mark. And that, my dear, is exactly why it mattered. You see, when the constable was still muddled about times and movements, that Larkspur told me it was you in the gatehouse, not Mrs. Durrant, long before you admitted it. I could not tell him then. It would only have complicated matters. But it told me the pattern was larger than the police imagined." Mrs. Ellison stared down at her lap. "Then, you knew all along I'd been meddling, and you still helped you?" Miss Marple's voice was mild. "We all meddle, Mrs. Ellison. Some from malice, some from fear, some from a misplaced sense of self-preservation. Yours was fear and a little curiosity, perhaps. I did not think you deserved to be crushed by a wheel you had not set in motion." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last, Mrs. Ellison looked up, her eyes bright with something halfway between relief and shame. "You're a better woman than I, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not at all. Simply an older one, with more time to watch how people behave." When Mrs. Ellison had gone, the little sitting room seemed even quieter. Miss Marple sat a moment longer, looking at the fire, feeling the case had now reached its true conclusion. Every part was in its place, every character's course set, at least for now. That evening, she walked to the gate and looked down the lane. Lamps were lit in windows, wreaths hung on doors, and the frost was settling into a fine white dust on the rooftops. The gatehouse stood dark and empty, its door fastened, its secret spent. She thought of the summer's beginning. The cry in the still air, the rush of footsteps, the swirl of talk. And how, from those first ripples, the whole hidden life of the lane had been drawn to the surface. She thought of the greed that had driven some, the pride that had blinded others, and the fear that had made yet more complicit. And she thought, too, of how all of it had been revealed, not by clever devices or grand chases, but by the smallest of things: a thread, a smear, a flower. As she turned back into her cottage, She felt the familiar satisfaction that came not from seeing justice loudly served, but from knowing the truth had been quietly, surely set in order. The lane was calm again, wrapped in its winter hush. But Miss Marple knew that human nature did not change with the seasons. Somewhere, behind one of those warmly lit windows, another story was already beginning to take shape. And when it came, she would be ready, watching, listening, and piecing together the smallest of details until the whole truth stood clear.